There we are. Excellent. Just in case.
Just in case we
going on
immediately
there.
jump in and
Yeah, which is a distinct possibility. Or maybe not. Maybe not. Maybe this
well,
will be
it's
a more
not happening
classic
this time.
episode.
So
Yeah, maybe not. Maybe it's going to be a more classic episode where we ramble on about something else for like half an hour beforehand.
That could happen.
Well,
ramble.
given the state of the world and just stuff that's happening, that's a very distinct possibility.
Oh no, not
Well,
the world.
I don't know. I
Please.
think we're a bit out, aren't we? Because watching the Masque of the Red Death, and there I am thinking, and the disease raged. People entered into lockdown, hoping to escape death, while their protectors partied on illegally.
Yes, if we'd have thought about it, we could have done this as a lockdown special, couldn't we? Would that have been in poor taste?
I think it would have been too on the nose when all those photographs and bits of footage of people partying at Conservative HQ started leaking. It would have been like,
honestly, I mean, throughout during the lockdown, I did a playthrough of a video game on my channel called Bloodborne, and for the uninitiated, Bloodborne is about a sort of fantasy, almost faux Victorian city which gets afflicted by a plague, and everyone else has to end up sealed inside their houses. So
the Red
this
Death
disease this disease ends up being Lovecraftian and turns them first into werewolves and then into hideous tentacle monstrosities. So a bit different, a little bit.
So a subtle allegory then.
Very much, very, very, very much so. Yes.
I seem to recall, Elliot, you telling us that you watched the 70s Body Snatchers in lockdown.
Yes.
When of course we talked about that movie. Did any of us watch this in lockdown? I was too sort of terrified and existentially depressed by the whole thing to be doing that sort of thing. But I know some people lent into it.
That was a
they watched
punishment with Survivors. I only watched the first season because only the first season's any good. The subsequent two seasons are real drag. I don't know if they had a change of. I think they had a change of producer or something, but the first season is really sort of stark and genuinely scary and kind of in our wheelhouse, and then the second season is just the good life. Episode after episode about trying to get the goat to make cheese or something, and then you get this very weird thing in the third season, which is slightly better than the second season, simply because they sort of get out again, and it's all shot in the winter, which just lends it up. But there's about 2 or 3 really great episodes, including quite an infamous one about they're contracting rabies. It's actually very, very well done. One of the guys obviously gets the whole hydrophobia, foaming at the mouth, and goes absolutely loopy, but it's very, very well shot. I think it's someone like Douglas Camfield, so it's really well done. But it was a case of being mad enough to watch the first season, basically skipping the second season and sampling the third season. But even then, it's like, I don't know what the hell was wrong with me and Vicky. There's obviously clear problems that during there's an epidemic that is literally taking out people. Let's watch Survivors. I mean,
let's watch Survivors.
What the fuck is wrong with me?
I assiduously cultivated my media during that period, and I avoided most things that involved diseases or plagues or epidemics.
Like any normal person, like any sensible, rational person. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but I did go through a phase of the Corman films, the Corman Poe cycle. We watched once a year, every Christmas Eve, I think, throughout the late 2010s. So we just
that's cool. They are good Christmas films.
Worked.
I don't know why, but they are.
It's just that it's late at night. It's the gothic and the uncanny, and we're still in the sort of the long phase of Samhain as far as I'm concerned.
That's right. They are very
dark
wintry
season
films, aren't they? Yeah, very wintry films. It makes sense somehow.
Yeah, and all the short stories like M.R. James or Le Fanu or Lovecraft or Poe get cracked out, or Eichmann get cracked out that time of year anyway. So
definitely.
You're inevitably looking for those things. But I remember doing them. Yeah, we did them in the order of their release. Although I think the one we're doing tonight is the apex.
Oh God, yeah. This is so much smarter than all the others. I mean, don't get me wrong. The others are pretty much, they're fairly faithful to the stories they're adapting. The others, this one is and isn't simultaneously. It incorporates other stories for one thing, most notably the Hot Frog, you know,
There's a
which
little-
this.
Yeah, there's a little bit of the system of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather about it as well. Just the image of the people partying. Although obviously in that Poe story they are the inmates of an asylum, but you get the same. They're all in fancy dress and they're all doing these sort of peculiar things like imitating animals and so on. So there's a indirect link to that story. Yeah.
Well, this one, I always find difficult to analyze because there is a point where my critical faculties just give up. It's such a lush, hypnotic, delirious affair, isn't it? The production is insane.
Yeah, it is kind of overwhelming. Yeah,
deliberately
I
so. I feel deliberately so. It's trying to create this almost febrile delirium in its audience. It's placing you in this kind of suggestible state of mind. Like the chromatic element, the colors. Colors are so. It could be aggressive. It could be too much, but somehow it balances it really well. Really, really well. The rooms, the chromatic rooms in Prospero's palace. There's something about that, the way it's portrayed. I mean, that is in the story. That is in the original story. But there's something about the way it's framed here that kind of shocks you. It makes you leap out when you see that sudden blast of yellow and then purple.
Well, it's one of those films that its own cheapness actually helps. Because if these films had more money, they would have. I mean, I think the film looks beautiful, but you know that its budget is low, and actually in those scenes, if they had more money, those sets would have been rather more detailed. And maybe a little bit more variation in them, but it is the fact that they are just there, and they are very clearly sets, and they are very clearly just like, well, it says we need a yellow room. Here's a yellow room. We need a red room. But because of the photography and the composition and the art direction and other respects, it works. It absolutely
does.
It is. Going for artificiality and theatricality anyway, so it's completely within it's completely successful at what it's trying to do. I think it would be a lesser film if in a way if it had much more budget. In fact, obviously when he made it years later, it didn't work because it's hopeless, the remake from the 80s.
One of the things that he was always very good at is making a virtue of necessity. And he does that thing where he just openly acknowledges that the fourth wall in that series of rooms just doesn't exist because he glides you through impossible space. He just glides through the division between the rooms following the characters, which is something that James Whale does that in the original Frankenstein, actually, which I rewatched recently. Inside the Baron's castle, the camera just, and it's interesting that he doesn't really do that in the Bride of Frankenstein, where he's got a bit more money, and I don't know. It's really because Bride of Frankenstein's an incredibly artificial movie in many respects, but he's not doing that sort of thing with the camera. Whereas in the original Frankenstein, he's being very open about the fact that he's filming something quite theatrical. Corman does the same sort of thing with that set. In the original story, it's 7 rooms of different colors, and they're obviously. I mean, the original story makes it specific that they're not in a straight line as well. The story actually says they're not in a straight line, and they do the opposite of that. They're obviously meant to be much bigger rooms than that as well in the original story, but they kind of like so many things. The clock from the story is in the film. But and they even have the moment where the clock chimes and everybody stops.
Yeah.
I love that moment with the clock as well, because not only is it absolutely lifting from the story, but particularly in the moment when Juliana is in the chamber, because of course the other thing that you're instantly meant to think of is Pit and the Pendulum.
It's in the pendulum,
because it's in such close up, and therefore it looks gigantic on the frame, and she's so tiny, and you know that it's a foreshadowing of her own death.
But not directly. It's very clever, isn't it? Because it kind of sets you up to believe that that's what's going to happen. That someone is going to get You know,
They
someone's
say a
going to
crow,
get
but
sliced
it's a
in
raven,
half.
isn't it? I mean, that's
Yeah,
it's another
it's
Poe
another Poe.
reference. You
It's
know, it's
another
the
Poe
raven that
reference.
tears
Yeah.
her to pieces and so on. An extraordinary scene and full of its own ambiguities as
Yes,
well.
and import. Given the ceremony that she goes through at
Mm.
one point in the film, and also the bizarre. I mean, probably the most surreal moment in the entire film, barring maybe the ending, where she has that dream of being not just a sacrifice, but the sacrifice, like the epitome of all sacrifices. She
Mm.
Yeah,
sees
in multiple cultures and
Yeah.
right. It's like she becomes the rarefication of what a sacrifice is and has been throughout all of history.
And it's interesting, isn't
Oh,
it? Because
yeah.
there's a certain it's almost like a reward to the audience, because that kind of dream sequence with the heavy use of color and the silence and the music and the soundscape becoming voices, that was a feature of every Corman film
yeah,
riffing on Poe up until that point. There's the one in the premature burial where he imagines all of the devices he has put in to save him from premature burial fail. There's the really excellent flashback in Pit and the Pendulum where he sees his father at work working for the Inquisition, and his mother, and then there's another in the fall of the House of Usher, and so on and so forth. So you at the beginning it's like, oh, you're sort of getting a kind of, yes, he's doing this thing because he always does this thing, but this one goes off on such an interesting tangent with its symbolism and just its as you say, its positioning of her as this sort of eternal sacrificial figure.
Well, from what I understand, Corman had a lot of trouble adapting this. He had a lot of trouble getting at the script that he liked, and having, reading the original short story, I can kind of see why. I mean, the original short story is it's very much a God's eye view. It's very generalized. You don't get the intimacy that you get in the film. You don't get like the very close focus on psychology and metaphysics and character motivation that you get in the film.
I mean, Prospero's almost not there in the story. I mean, Prospero's not to be recognised with all his with his modus operandi and with his confusions and his ambiguities as a person and his inconsistencies. That all comes from the film, and apparently I did read somewhere that Price was very, very active as well. He said he didn't just turn up, learn the lines, and ask a few questions. He was there from inception. He said he was Corman said this directly. So he was very, very heavily involved in the full making up of Prospero.
You can kind of see it. You can kind of see it in his performance. The guy is invested in this. By a significant margin. I mean, in the chat earlier, he's fantastic. I mean, as the core of this film, he's essentially the protagonist of the film, isn't he? I mean, I know it frames Francesca in that way as well, but it's him. It really is him. It's his.
He is interesting because he is a key figure from that time when you could be an oddball and a theatrical character actor, but also a leading man as long as it were in genre movies, but still do it truthfully. Now he can be as campy as hell in some of his movies, but this one demands this sort of controlled theatrical excess, and that's exactly what he gives. I was really struck by how still he is in some moments and how interior he is. Even when he's full of flourish, there's a lot of thinking going on, and you can see the moments. I think it's a really good example of him at his best. You can see the moments where he's uncertain. He's uncertain about what it is he's actually doing, and what
these lovely moments
things is.
Yeah, just lovely moments of ambiguity in the performance. This character who
the bit where he refuses to let Francesca into the final room,
right?
And it becomes obvious. You think, to start with, in that moment, you think that there's something that he doesn't want her to see, and then it becomes that he's afraid for her, and then it becomes no, he's just afraid. He's afraid for himself as well, and he does that. The 3-part reaction, almost like peeling an onion, in the space of a couple of lines, mostly with his eyes. It's so
there are layers and layers and layers to the performance. I mean, there is a tendency to take the character of Prospero as he is in the film in a very simplistic way, I find. just as a libertine, as a cyberite, as a Satanist, and
He's
that's
not
it. He's not, though, is he? That's the thing,
not,
right?
though.
He's not. He's not right.
You never see him eating anything.
Engaged
You barely
in
see him
anything.
drinking anything. He
has
never
got
tries
no
to put the moves on any of the women.
No,
He's not. He's not taking part.
No,
He is not drinking to excess or eating to excess, or he's not even taking direct part in the cruelty.
Nope.
He's, I mean, what he kind of is a film director. He's telling people, you stand there and you do this and stuff like that. That's part of what's going on. But the reading of Prospero as a libertine is completely wrong.
Yeah.
He's contemptuous of that. He's actually contemptuous.
Yep, when he's throwing the jewels
in
to
the people that he
his
surrounded himself with.
Yeah, when he's throwing the jewels from the balcony, and he's basically, it is pearls before swine, as he says. He's seeing them as filth and as animals, and he's using their reaction to reinforce his own incredibly cynical, misanthropic ideology, which doesn't have sensuality and eroticism and joy at its core. It has despair. Ultimately, he's a man in despair. He does confess it to Francesca as well. You get the impression when he gives her that wonderful talk about how God is dead and there's something else ruling in his place, and the world, there is no kind or benevolent God looking over this world. Look at the pestilence and the famine and the war and whatnot. You get the impression of a guy who is in mourning for a faith that he maybe once had. He's not even really a Satanist. He's kind of a disappointed Christian, isn't he?
The way he's engaged by Francesca and her Christianity it's there. I mean, you think it's a means to ridicule and deconstruct it, but her Christianity is something he recognizes and very in part shares. I mean, he defends her from Alfredo, of course, quite near the beginning. There's that sense that it's because she is a kind of paragon. I mean, how can he live his life the way he does except by embracing the do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law philosophy of satanic ritual, the beyond good and evil of, we said in the back chat, we mentioned Nietzsche, the rejection of slave morality and all that, the assertion of this sort of warrior noble who uses men for the betterment of all, allegedly. I mean, that's the Nietzschean thing. And then, the teachings of Christ are far too removed from his experience now, even as they are embedded in him, because he, of course, comes from a Christian culture. Now, of course, he could warp those teachings and in the way very rich and evangelical churches do now, but he doesn't. There's a sense that he finds Francesca and he kind of needs her. He needs her as a kind of, they're like compasses.
He wants her to prove him wrong. Consciously, what he thinks he's doing is that he's going to corrupt somebody innocent and pure, and he's going to enjoy doing that. But he never really puts any great effort into doing that. What he clearly wants is for her to win. He wants her to convince him. He's not actually trying to convince her. He's hoping that she will convince him. On some level, he is hoping that she will restore his faith, which of course he hasn't actually lost, because you can't believe in Satan without believing in God.
Well, yes, absolutely.
If you are a Satanist, you are, in that sense, you are essentially still a Christian.
You are de facto a Christian, right? You are you believe, you are operating within the constraints of the mythology, and that really is Prospero's downfall, isn't it? He's like someone he's at an arrested state of development, metaphysically speaking, isn't he? So he's seen the world, he's seen the what he considers to be the corruption and the darkness and the evil and the suffering. And rather than using that as a springboard to something greater, to something better, he's actually retreated into the traditional prescriptions of his pre-existing belief system, and is throwing a temper tantrum at them. It's really quite amazing. He's a petty shit. Metaphysically speaking, he's a really petty shit.
It positions Francesca and Gino as the heroic young couple that you're supposed to root for. But it's very interesting at the end, you don't get the reunion scene. You don't get the scene you just get Francesca sent away by the figure in red. And the texture in that scene where the figure tells her to go to the battlements, and Prospero completely misunderstands what's happening. And he says, yes, go, I'll meet you. And she knows perfectly well that he is doomed. She knows that he's not going to be following her. She understands that the figure is sending her away to escape and be reunited with Gino. And obviously, she knows that she can't say that to him, because if she does, he will not let her go. But at the same time, as she looks at him, as she parts from him, she is so sad. Jane Asher's performance is so great. She's so she kind of loves him. She sees the good man that is in there somewhere, or was in there somewhere, and she does feel for him.
Yeah.
It's very sad that she's leaving him to die, but she knows it's happening. But she does leave. You know, this is one of the things the film interrogates is Christian morality. You have the scene where Prospero explicitly challenges the Christian characters about, well, you've killed people. Aren't you supposed to not do that? By your faith, you're supposed to turn the other cheek. And of course, I think in my terms, they don't do anything wrong at all. If you're being held hostage by an oppressive ruler and you have to kill the guards to escape, fucking kill them. But
the people who are torturing you,
the letter of the law in Christianity is that you slaves obey your masters with fear and trembling. If somebody strikes you, turn the other cheek. Thou shalt not kill. That is the letter of the law that these people supposedly subscribe to. So Prospero has pointed out a genuine hypocrisy in there, but they get away. But you don't see Gino and Francesca reunited. You don't see the kiss, the clinch, the embrace, them escape. You get Prospero's death, and then you cut to the personifications of the different plagues having their meeting, and they talk about the fact that Francesca and Gino have gone away, but you don't see, because this film is not really about the heroic young, morally pure Christian couple, because this is not, despite the fact that it sort of pretends to be, this is not a Christian film. This is not about, the moral superiority of Christianity. I think Francesca and Gino's Christianity is as mistaken as Prospero's belief system, which is, as we've been saying, is actually kind of, without him realizing it, just a different kind of that Christian slave morality.
And
I think that's
whittled down as well. I mean, her faith, which he has been, he has been Prospero, has been interested. He's brought her into his domain for the reasons I agree with the way you perceive it, but it doesn't last. I mean, it's not an enduring faith. She's almost repudiating it by the end. She's like, I don't care.
She's shaken. Yeah.
I don't care. There is the horror and the torture any longer.
There is a point where she is unveiled, right? And Prospero, as you said, Prospero's arguments against her ideology are not that great. They're not that interested. He doesn't do anything that profound to shatter them. But by the end, she is almost unveiled into his worldview. And it's interestingly, he's inculcated in her the same species of despair and abandon that he embraces ultimately. It's not, as you say, it's not erotic, it's not libertine. He is not seeing some joy or pathway to a grander metaphysics or condition through his apparent Satanism. It's an expression of despair.
In fact, it seemed watching it almost to be like, curiously, the inverse of a very real story. I mean, a historical story, which is Gilles de Rais, who this man who fought alongside Joan of Arc, who was completely swept up in Joan of Arc's claims, but then becomes actually far more of the libertine than Prospero is. A man who really did delve into alchemy and demon summoning and heresy, and someone who abducted and abused and murdered children. It's very significant how Prospero is very strong about the girl, the little girl, the little peasant,
not the child,
saved.
Right? What a strange note for this guy who claims to be anti-morality of any kind. Right?
And it's interesting that right at the beginning of the film, they almost reenact that moment from, we were talking about Dickens last week, but A Tale of Two Cities, where the French aristo runs down the child in the carriage and then doesn't think much of it and sort of says to the people, why do you let your children play in the street? Whereas he just misses her, and then
Yeah.
I don't know if it's the same peasant girl, but obviously he orders for her to be spared at the end. But
Yes.
but the real historical character Gilles de Rais was far more wicked than anything that Prospero is presented as being.
Well, that's the thing about Prospero. His apparent wickedness is almost always performative, isn't it? It's almost aesthetic, even though he does do genuinely wicked things. It's in service to something else. It's like he's always trying to demonstrate what I believe is correct, what I believe is right, and it doesn't matter who he's engaging with. That's what he's doing all the time. It's an act of narcissistic dominion that he's engaging in.
It's also a sign of intense insecurity and fragility, in your opinions, when you have to react that way to challenge. When he goes to the village to do the routine thing, which is quite historically accurate. The Lord, I don't know if he would go personally, but very often in these sorts of setups, the Lord would invite the peasants to a kind of a party and thank them for their labor over the course of the year and stuff like that. That was real stuff, and it would sometimes be a lot more familiar than we would ever imagine. But that sort of thing would happen. But Prospero turns on a dime from that, performative, and kind of it's a kind of fulfillment of the social contract, between the villains and the Lord. He turns on a dime because people talk back to him. The desperation to get Francesca's father and Gino to fight each other, and all the things he does, they smack of insecurity in his beliefs and his position.
Yeah, totally. I also think his relationship to Francesca is also true. I think part of the reason he's so fascinated by her is, as you say, part of his insecurity is that he just cannot abide any alternative existing.
And there's a strong sense of fear of death. I mean, fear of absolutes, I suppose, because and that's something that is very strongly post-text. Absolutes. No matter how much you gain mastery over, and he is the feudal lord, it is everything hemorrhages at the point of death, and that, like the human body, susceptible to disease and abuse, which this text is also about. There is a disease out there is a plague, but there is also the abuses carried out by other people onto the human body and the human psyche. These things are absolutes, and death still gets into Prospero's world, both as a spirit but also obviously through implication, because this is an airborne virus, and no one is unscathed. It takes tyrannical nobles, oppressed peasants alike. The few get away, have completed. It seems like the few that get away have completed some kind of trial of strength, whether it's
feels like that, doesn't it? Or just sort of like an annealing process, a rite of some description,
or having impressed the forces, as Hoptoad does when he gains his revenge. I mean, I find Prospero's reaction to Hoptoad interesting, because I always come to that scene because in the intervening years, you slightly forget details and think, oh God, he's going to pay for that. And then Prospero goes, thank you so much. That was marvelous. And I know
Prospero's delighted
in terms of you've provided me with an entertainment, but because of all the other information going on in the film, certainly pertaining to Francesca, it feels like something slightly more, that he actually sees something just in it, which again
something moral,
casts this moral thing, as you say, over Prospero, which is not fitting with what he's saying about himself.
So brilliantly contradictory.
He has contempt
all the time
for Alfredo.
Yes, totally. Yeah, strikes
total
him.
Contempt. Yeah.
I love the scene where he throws the wine in Alfredo's face unexpectedly, as obviously revenge for him having struck Esmeralda. I think that is so psychologically telling. On some deep level, Prospero is disgusted by that act, but he can't morally acknowledge that disgust. There has to be a delay, and then he has to reframe it as something else. But he's at least as much of his cruelty and tyranny is directed towards the people of his own class as it is to the peasants. He murders the guy that turns up asking to be let in, and so on and so forth. But the thing about the deaths, this is a revolutionary film in some respects. When the Red Death, the personification of the Red Death at the start of the film says, your deliverance is coming, he's talking about the annihilation of the oppressive system that exists in that area, that he will bring via the disruption that is the plague. And the people who escape, it's Hoptoad, it's Esmeralda, it's Gino and Francesca. it's the people who have fought back, who have tried to escape. They are the peasants who go to the Lord and say, please let us in, we're sorry for bleeding on your shoes. They don't get saved. It's the people that fought back.
Who try to smack open pull the escape cord of history. I mean that
exactly
are somewhat rewarding. And of course you can't help but look at it.
Sorry, go on.
No, I was just going to say, you can't help but look at it in terms of those, and knowing a bit what Corman was like as a man as well, you can't help but look at it in terms of those political metaphors. I mean, Vicky and I were talking when we came to the end of it on Saturday, and I said, this is 1964 and it's peak Cold War and it's the Red Death. Now we know that comes from Poe, but that generation had already had the bejesus scared out of them because of things like the Cuban Missile Crisis in '62. There's definitely a sense of Corman suggesting that the 60s party going on in America and in Europe is happening while something potentially apocalyptic is sort of at the gates of civilization. But the thing I like about the way Corman, in his schlocky way, does these things, he sort of then says, but what is civilization? It's an exploitative, class-ridden nightmare of privilege on the one hand and suffering on the other. I mean, we've moved from the feudalism of Prospero's time, but only to the imperialist capitalist era of the mid-20th century. The basic makeup isn't all that altered. I mean, you only have to factor in, say, at that point in the 60s, people of color in 60s America. What the fuck's changed, really? And and this film is blazoned on it, Red Death.
I think it's not unproblematic, but I think you can read Hoptoad and Esmeralda as kind of subtextually people of color.
Yes, I think you can.
Or any sort obviously, of marginalized demographic, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
The fact that he's gone there as well, because those are very separate stories in Poe's canon. The fact
aren't they? It's difficult to meld. It's difficult to sort of insert it in here, but somehow he does it thematically.
It's great. I mean, not only because for him as a director trying to make 3 reels, it fleshes out the film, but I thought I still think it's a great choice in terms of theme as well, because obviously theme of the cruelty of the ruling class, who the other common people, as Jack was saying, but to the point of not seeing them as human. And I think the triumph of the film is that it shows how this sort of creeps. Prospero can be just as callous to his own class, as we acknowledged earlier, because they are below him, as Hoptoad and Esmeralda and Francesca and her family are below them. And then you're sort of reminded, even though he's gone into the story of Hopfrog or Hoptoad here, that reminds you then of things like the cask of Amontillado, and as I said earlier, the system of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. So it's a proper mosaic, this film. It's definitely the Masque of the Red Death. That's what it says on the tin, and that's the thing he's doing. But
and a lot of the original story is
other things
in it in one form or another.
It sort of uses it as a framing device, doesn't it? Then inserts lots of other stuff from Poe within that framing device.
The basic idea, obviously, the original story has all sorts of relevances and dimensions to it, but the basic idea of the story is there is a plague, a ruler retreats behind castle walls with his friends, and they enjoy excess and luxury, but the plague gets in anyway. That is the story. That's what we get on film.
That's pretty much it.
But I think I agree with you totally about the Hoptoad subplot, and I just want to say on a kind of a more basic note, Skip Martin, the actor who plays Hoptoad, he's so good. That guy should have been a megastar. He's so charismatic. He's so characterful. He's so fucking sexy.
And we know the reasons that he
in a better world,
and that's the frustrating thing, because we need as you say, we need a fucking better world for that. Because there's also, because I've seen Skip Martin and other things, and what a versatile guy, because that was not anything like the other stuff he appeared in and what he was cast to do. But he I read a little bit about his life, which was fascinating. He was very popular on film sets, because he was just basically one of those actors who went, all right, I'll do that. Which, he called, but also the Skip, most actors like, well, I'm not doing that, and I've got to speak to my agent or my publicist. But the other thing, he was called Skip because he basically skipped years at school. He was like really bright as well. You know, he was a smart cookie. He was academically.
Interesting.
So
Well, he does radiate intelligence.
Oh, he does.
He's got
got
incredibly clever eyes, and yeah.
But I mean, considering you've got Price and you've got Patrick McGee, who I love. He's such a strange character actor. I mean, but then this lesser known actor, Skip Martin, comes in and you pretty almost steals it. He's so good.
It's certainly the midpoint of the film where that plot is escalating. It's his film, isn't it? Prospero kind of steps back a little bit.
But it's a good
This one is really blessed with the cast as well, which is not something you can always say with Corman movies, I'm afraid. But this one has, I mean, Price is on his absolutely greatest form. Patrick McGee, as you say, Skip Martin, we've just been talking about. And also Hazel Court is so intense in this.
She really is.
And Jane Asher's so good as well. And whoever the guy is doing the voice of the Red Death, he's amazing as well.
What a voice!
I love.
I mean, he almost sounds like Christopher Lee as well. So it's
right. The vocal performance of the Red Death is so interesting. I love the metaphysics. I mean, this is something the film does, which is really fascinating. I'm not even sure Gript intended it or the film intended it, but it's the way it comes off. Which is, by the end, you get this suggestion that the metaphysical language that both Francesca and Prospero, and in fact every human character is playing with, is totally redundant. It's too myopic, it's too prescribed, it doesn't describe or encapsulate what is actually going on. There is metaphysics in this film. There are these personifications of the plagues, the chromatic deaths, and they have some really interesting moments and lines. You have that one at the beginning when the Red Death says to the old woman that is his sort of like harbinger, the means by which he's carried into the village. He says to her, "Your salvation is at hand."
Yeah.
And he doesn't mean that on an individual. Yes, your deliverance. He doesn't mean it on an individual level. He doesn't mean it in a Christianic sense.
Oh.
Because it certainly isn't that. Certainly not for the old woman and not for the people of the village, because a lot of them die horribly of the Red Death. He means it, as Jack said earlier, in a systemic way.
Aren't just forces of. They're certainly not forces of chaos. They are working to some kind of
like
just
a plan, a design,
but
right?
there's justice. It doesn't mean that everyone's going to be saved, but there is a sort of. It's about pushing history along.
Yes,
history.
Exactly.
That's what they are. They are.
History,
they are personifications of history. And that's, I said it's a revolutionary film. It is. Exactly. It is in a sense about a revolution. And there is I think it's sometimes overstated, but there is a huge extent to which the bubonic plague did cause the fall of feudalism.
Yeah.
Right.
It was a part of why you ended up with stuff like the peasants' revolt and the Jacquerie in France and stuff like this that did start the process of feudalism being destroyed. These things are part of history. You can't reduce history to the contingency of a plague, but plagues are part of what we do as well. I mean, one of the plagues talks about being brought across national boundaries, across seas by ship, doesn't he?
Yeah.
So the blue one, I believe.
Yeah, that's human history as well. That plague is not just something that happens to us; it's something that we do. We only have to look back a few years' time to see how much how much agency we have in causing these things ourselves and then making them worse. So it is history, and it's.
I think this is very much
it's metaphysics in the true sense, isn't it? Because it's treating history as almost like personified in these first principles.
Yes.
Right.
And it's interesting because I think another film entirely almost makes this more explicit, because if you remove plague and disease and replace with war, then it is effectively, I mean, it's almost schematic. It is the plot of Pasolini's Solo. I mean, it is, it's just Second World War Italy. It tells the same story with an equally fierce political angle. But I think if we have to be, it's that thing of like, when Pasolini does it, it's called art, and when poor Roger Corman does it, it's not. But
it's called schlock, right? It's called schlock.
But then I was thinking about that. What I love about this film, so I'm just going off on a tangent. Do bring it back to what we were talking about. But as I watched, I went, this is simultaneously kind of. I think you have said the point in the message chat that we were having, Jack, that it's simultaneously schlock and art house, because it's at an intersection of so many things.
This is that Corman alchemy. He could do that.
Yeah.
But he could make these mass popular schlocky movies, and they have this incredible sort of oblique, artsy, surrealist, indirect way that makes demands on audiences. Popcorn audiences went to see this because it's Vincent Price and it's got death in the title and it's a horror movie. But you get into it and as an audience, this film is making demands on you to interpret not only what's happening, but the meaning of what's happening.
Passively. Yeah. But it also, I think, makes sense in terms of his subject matter, because as the credits rolled, I went, well, of course, Poe himself existed on the same kind of intersection
the same level.
And this movie, his work was intense magazine fodder. It was consumed by readers who loved that kind of transgressive sensationalism, but they are still lasting, very beautifully sculpted prose pieces that are kind of timeless. But Poe himself would present his poetry and prose to roomfuls of women who were who delighted in the fact that they could take a break from being women and all that, and just get a thrill. And of course, he was like a kind of matinee idol to them, in the same way that Vincent Price was a matinee idol in his younger years. It's like people used to go and listen to Poe recite his women almost exclusively. Poe recite his poetry to get a kind of, it was like seeing a rock star. And so you still have that same intersection of pop culture, the literary, the mass-produced, and it's there in the Corman, obviously, the unashamedly studio-based artificiality, the expressionism, the color. But as you say, it is there to be interpreted. And of course, he's got that wonderful, there's that wonderful alchemy of the fact that his part-time art director and cinematographer is Nicholas Roeg, who's also got a head full of stuff that's going to come into full expression in 10 years' time. Now, whether Corman
already discussed on this podcast,
so whether Corman, in his wonderful self-deprecatory manner, said, "I don't know whether I was the midwife to Nick Roeg. I don't know whether he watched me at work and went, I can," or he watched me at work and went, "That's what not to do." But that, I think, is just being self-deprecating, because this film is got all that in embryo of things like Don't Look Now and The Man Who Fell to Earth and Walkabout, the composition, the color, the cinematography. But yes, it's there to be interpreted. That is exactly right. It is not. It is a popcorn cinema movie. It is a piece of 1960s drive-in cinema. But at the same time, it's not just there to be passively consumed.
No, it makes demands on its audience. It expects you to be literate. It actually expects you to listen to the language and to appreciate ambiguities. And I love it for that. Underneath all that superficial lavishness, there is an incredibly complex machine churning away.
Yeah, I love the Hammer movies. I'm an unashamed Hammer fan.
Ditto.
You get to the end of the original Hammer Dracula or the original Hammer Frankenstein. Great movies, artistic in their ways, but there's no question. And there's no problem understanding at the end of the 1958 Dracula what's happening, right? No audience is going to be looking at the scene with Christopher Lee pulling Peter Cushing pulling the curtains down and saying, "What's happening? I don't get." Right. To a certain extent, in all these Corman movies, there always comes a moment, at least one moment, and it's at its absolute most in this one, because this is the greatest of the bunch. But there's always a moment where the film, will go out of its way to puzzle the audience, to challenge the audience, to make the audience interpret what they're seeing. The end of this film, we talked about it when we started. The way the end builds to this sort of crescendo of surrealism, it becomes, it's silent interpretive ballet at one point. At the end of this film.
It actually becomes more theatrical,
outright surrealism. And the dialogue is so bleak, and it's it's not clear. It's not going to be clear to the entire audience exactly what's happening.
Nope.
And
it is not.
That's amazing in this kind of film, that he did this over and over again. And I think I'm glad that we've kind of got onto the question of Corman, because we originally decided to do this. This was originally going to be our Christmas episode, but life.
Life,
but
etc.
we did this because Roger Corman passed away last year, and I think we wanted to mark it. But it's interesting, isn't it? How connected? I mean, Corman was connected to the. He had all these waves that came off him. We've talked about The Shining. Jack Nicholson came up in the Corman School of Filmmaking.
Right.
Yeah.
Nicholas Roeg, that we've talked about. Jane Asher in Ghostwatch.
Yeah.
The tentacles of this are everywhere. It is so influential.
Yeah.
Not Ghostwatch, Stone Tape. You know what I mean?
I knew what you meant.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right there, though, Jack, about Hammer and so on, because I remember being a kid and being introduced to Hammer by my dad. It was my gateway, and Universal and Hammer was my gateway to all this stuff. It was slightly on the safer side, even though if you some of the Hammer movies were still probably a bit ripe for a child. But
some of them, particularly the later ones, definitely.
Yeah, but I do remember these Poe Corman movies coming on in the late 80s, and I remember my dad getting the VHS and saying, "Oh, there's a really great film on." It was Pit and the Pendulum. That was the first on the show. Oh, there's a really great film on tonight that you'll love. And I remember watching it on a Sunday afternoon. And even as a from this point,
that's pretty strong fare for a kid.
For a Sunday afternoon,
as we have said many times, my parents had no clue how to raise children, and certainly with regards to what
there are bits
viewing.
in that movie that are pretty fucking disturbing.
He just basically went, "Oh, this is a great movie. It's on really late. I will record it, and you can watch it during the day tomorrow." Because he knew I loved the Hammer films and the Universal films. So off I go down into the living room when they're doing whatever they're doing, and it was one winter afternoon. I watched it, but I remembered even then, as you say, that just something I couldn't rationalize. I couldn't articulate in the way I can now. But I knew it was, this is in a different place to those Hammer movies and Universal movies I've been watching. This is really quite strange, even when it's not outre. We're like in the flashback sequence, everything about it is strange, and you get that intuitively, even as a child who's a bit too young to be watching it.
No central character in a Hammer movie ever had a psychological journey of the kind that Price's character has in Pit and the Pendulum.
No.
Not one.
Let alone Masque of the Red Death.
Let alone this one, right? Yeah.
It is terrifying when he does. I mean, and again, it's that thing that we've just said about Corman. It's sort of schlocky and at the same time utterly terrifying when he sort of regresses into being his father, or so, having worked in Pit and Pendulum. I mean, which is an addition of Corman's. It's not in the text.
Not in the text. No, the text is very oblique, actually, and very general.
Yeah. It's almost really, isn't it?
It's a sensory experience. I mean, the story is a guy who wakes up in the dark and doesn't know what's happening effectively.
Yeah. But the moment where when he starts to take on the role of his father, because his whole worldview's exploded. But even purely Corman, I remember even as a child thinking, this is so strange, because when you see the Pit and the Pendulum, it's this column of rock, like a cliff, which goes just down and down and down into the sea under the abbey or whatever it is, and the walls are all daubed in almost like cave paintings of carnage and horror, and they're all, and you think, this is, even the art direction is like nothing. This is not what it should be like. If this was in the hands of another director or filmmaker who specialized in genre movies or the Gothic, we wouldn't be getting this stuff. And it's all rather like the use of almost like glorified lava lamps and paintings.
There's a refutation of literalism in these interpretations, isn't there, in these adaptations? And it's something you definitely get in The Masque of the Red Death. It's theatrical all the way through. At the end, it actually throws off any pretense to literalism or to even rationality and becomes play on screen. When the Red Death turns up, and suddenly the carnage, the dance, the mask is choreographed.
Yes,
he is directing the dancers. He is directing the entire scene. It's absolutely the only one who is not directed is Prospero.
It becomes a dream. It becomes figurative. It becomes full on
Right.
surrealism.
And I've got to be a broken record again, but my God, this is, as I said, this is 1960s. Take your girlfriend / boyfriend to the drive-in, and this is mainstream schlock 3-reel popcorn film. What? There's nothing like.
But there was an opening. There was an opening for that kind of thing in the arts at this point in history. And Corman, he's just, he sees that crack and he's in there.
The crack is sealed up now. That's
exactly. Yeah. But he,
not even a scar, right?
Not everybody even saw the crack. A lot of people kept on churning out the same old crap, even in that moment of incredible possibility. You cannot say that about Roger Corman. Roger Corman saw the opening and he thought, let's get in there and be as strange and oblique and artsy. And and he was always, as you were saying about the production design in Pit and the Pendulum, this is something that's true of almost all these movies. There is something, they're all set in the past. They're all gothic and period costume and so on and so forth.
Past that we recognize.
But they're also all incredibly 60s.
Yeah.
And it's because he was
of the House of Usher, the paintings. They're very 60s.
Yeah.
I'd love those paintings that he does, the portraits.
Oh yeah, I want those. I want those
They
paintings all.
I would kill for those.
I love them so much. I love that. I love that film as well. But he was always so of his moment, Corman, and he did that throughout his entire career as well. When he gets into his, into the 1970s, he's not still making 60s movies. He's making 70s movies, and then into the 80s, he's not making 70s movies anymore. He's making 80s movies. Corman always loved the present. He always wanted to be steeped in the aesthetics and the mood of the moment.
Yeah. Very much so, yeah.
But he also has a quality of investing those aesthetics with weight and meaning, as in this film. I mean, it's impossible not to try and engage with why, isn't it? What is this? What is this kaleidoscope that we're seeing? Like the chromatic deaths. What is that? What is the significance of that? And of course, it's not literal. There is no one single intention or interpretation there. You can bring almost what you like to it.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, they are the personifications of the different plagues, but
what does that mean? What does that mean?
Exactly.
I mean, like
that's not an
plagues
answer,
themselves.
is it?
The plagues themselves are kind of metaphorical here. They're emblematic of any kind of phenomena that doesn't occur within the systems, which is antithetical to the system. So they can be anything in that regard. They could be Lovecraftian. It's cosmological horror in that regard.
Well, they're not even all necessarily plagues, are they? So that you could have maybe one of them is the Red Death and one of them is low fever, but another one could be revolution. Another one could be whatever,
disruption or
another
whatever, uprising,
religion, or we're fully in the realm of figuration. And it's delicious, and as I say,
I think the way it's baked into the script as well.
Is history.
Yeah, it's baked into the script as well.
History. Yeah,
I mean the Red Death himself has some fascinating lines. They're almost throwaway. They're only momentary. You need to be engaged to catch them.
Yeah.
So when Prospero is he's starting to realize that he's got it wrong. That this entity it's not operating within the purview of his beliefs. Essentially, it's something else, and he's bickering with it. He's basically saying, "Well, Satan rules the world," and the Red Death says, "Yes, but not alone."
Yeah, he doesn't deny the existence of Satan. Satan is a force, and I think
Satan is an idea
in a world.
Satan is an idea.
Yeah,
so it must be a force.
Exactly. The idea is a force in the world, in a metaphysics where the Black Death has a personification. Then of course there's a Satan, because people believe in it, because it's a force in the world.
Yes, it moves people, right? It is an active force in that regard. So is everything. So is everything in that regard. But he doesn't rule alone. There's so much freight in that. There's so much freight. Not only but primarily with regards to Prospero, because that is when he's done.
And Prospero's conception of it is all, as you said in the chat, it's all about transaction. He conceptualizes. Yeah, he can see his metaphysics, his idea of the supernatural or the universal or the cosmic or whatever. It's entirely personal. It's entirely petty. It's entirely about him. It's entirely based on, chains of hierarchy, superiority and inferiority, deals, contracts. I give you, I get in return. That's his entire concept, because he is a cynic. He is a total cynic. He is a.
You cannot I think imagine outside of those assumptions. He just can't. He lacks the capacity.
In fact, he's in that respect, he's incredibly modern for a feudal lord. He has the language, the vocabulary, and the intentions of a mercantile capitalist at this point.
Yeah, and it's not unlike the way. It's not unlike the way, Shakespeare writing in the early modern era, the era of primitive accumulation, rising capitalism. He writes Richard III, who of course is another character that Vincent Price played, as one of the new men of his era. He writes Richard III as a man who's all about contracts and deals and money, and uses money metaphors constantly. And of course, Richard III and the entire cast of characters in the Wars of the Roses plays, they're all from hundreds of years before Shakespeare was born. They're from before the period when the primitive accumulation started.
King Lear is, there's this pre-Christian play, and it is absolutely obsessed with money and deals and apportioning value. It's there.
Well, that's all. That play is on a deep level. It's all about the conversion of the entire world from a feudal set of values, a feudal economic and political setup to a capitalist one. But the point being that Shakespeare writes these new men of his time, these entrepreneurial men. He writes them into the past.
And this guy's even called Prospero.
He's even called Prospero.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah.
Prospero, who in Shakespeare is, he's a magician, but he's also kind of a colonialist.
And he holds up in a place of his own to
yes, that's right.
He's haunted by monsters.
The slave and
and has fools, has tricksters, tricksters visit the island, come to the island, descend on him. Yeah, absolutely.
But he's one of the Corman gets to Prospero via Poe, because Poe uses the name in his story, and I think in Poe's story the etymological reading is the point, isn't it? Prospero, as in prosperity, as in wealth.
Yes, that's exactly.
Yeah. And Poe is making, amongst the other things Poe's doing, Poe's making points about, the transitoriness of everything. In the face of certain death, you can accrue as much luxury and wealth and so on as you like, and it doesn't ultimately make any difference. You still die, no matter how much you rage at the figure in red.
I was saying it's
the figure in red will get in and kill you.
It's a story about absolutes.
But
absolute
Corman, of course, is adapting this. Corman and his writers are adapting this in the early 1960s, which is inevitably going to, this is the era of the high point of the American empire, the high point of the American post-war capitalist boom, the beginnings of, well, not the beginnings quite, but really the triumph of mass consumerism. And I think a hell of a lot of what this film is getting at is that. And Corman always had that kind of gadfly satirical impulse in throughout his career.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, you can see it in so many of his projects. Yeah.
And of course, he wrinkles the story deliberately by just throwing in a few fascinating images. So, for example, the Red Death revealing that it has Prospero's face, for example.
Yes, of course, not in the text. That's entirely
not in the text at all.
And of course, it's wonderful. And then again, it's what Jack was saying earlier about that high 60s thing, because then you start thinking, oh well, yeah, that's the sort of thing that will happen again later in The Prisoner. The road that rips off the mask and it is yourself. So it's tapping into a lot of things in the air in the 60s about the divided self, and everyone was reading psychology and psychoanalysis.
Well, this is it, right? It brings it down to the psychological level.
Yeah.
It intermingles the metaphysical and the psychological here.
Absolutely,
But it also reflects, as indeed the identity stuff at the end of The Prisoner, and I think Fallout, the last episode of The Prisoner, is probably directly influenced by this in some respects.
Yes.
That's partly about the fact that that the metaphor of the village means various things throughout the series. but part of what it means, of course, is the prison of the self. And
Right.
you know, in very that rings true at various registers across the prisoner. You know, the prison of the self is something you can talk about politically or culturally as well as individually. And I think this film is also, it's getting at something similar, which is that Prospero is just, you know, he is ultimately completely unable to see anything outside himself, isn't he?
Yes.
But it is really, I mean, his actions throughout this are intensely self-destructive. I think this is part of what this is getting at, is the way in which evil seeks its own self-destruction, which again ties it in with the Shakespearean characters like Richard III, actually.
Yes, I think it's also getting at the fact that Prospero throughout advertises himself, he markets himself as this sort of metaphysical revolutionary who is changing the systems and the assumptions somehow, but what he's actually doing is perpetuating them. So he rails against the fact of the Red Death, of the plague and famine and whatnot. But he will always be part of the systems and of the class that is causing these things. He is not the answer. He is not the solution, and he never will be. He never
Well, as you
will
said,
be.
he's incapable of seeing those answers or even those alternate possibilities.
Right.
He is the ultimate sort of disappointed idealist. That's what a cynic is. Somebody said a disappointed idealist who's just, and you called it a temper tantrum. It is. It's just, you know, I can't believe in goodness. I can't imagine goodness. Therefore, there isn't any. Therefore, the entire universe is as shitty and cruel and petty and selfish as I am. Therefore, I'm just going to treat everything as if it's worthless.
Yes, of course, it's a lovely position to be in when you're so much power that you can say those things and still be kind of insulated from the worst of it. And of course, that's the rug being pulled at the end. It's like, well, you may think you can, and in many ways you are insulated, but you cannot be insulated from me.
There's a weird sort of metaphysical political
history by extension.
And history, yes.
There's a very strange metaphysical and political scapegoating going on in Prospero's worldview here. It's like he's acknowledged on some level, he has acknowledged that his class and the systems in which he operates, which have given birth to him ultimately, are what causes the misery in the world that he cites as the reasons for his belief system. And what he's done in order to absolve himself of responsibility for it, he said, "Oh no! It's the absence of God. It's the fact that Satan rules the world, right? Oh, this is not us. It's not the systems. It's Satan. That's right.
Yeah.
There's also the very interesting bit where the script goes out of its way to have Prospero talk about his father. There's no need for this to suddenly come in at all. There just isn't any dramatic need for his father to even be mentioned. But in the scene where he's showing Francesca the rooms, he takes her into the yellow room and he says, "My father imprisoned somebody in this room for years, and after he was released, he couldn't even bear to look at a sunset or a daffodil," which, you know, is great stuff by itself. But it's that reference that the film goes out of its way to put in. This makes it clear that, in a sense, Prospero is somebody who is himself just a prisoner of a continuing system. He is a victim, right? Yeah, he is himself the product of just this continuing system. He's the product of a father that used to do these things to him.
It used to be abusive, right? So it's not much of a stretch to infer that he was abusive to Prospero too, right?
Yeah, I mean, you could even read that scene as being Prospero talking about that being done to him. He's just hiding the fact that he's talking about himself. That might be something that his father did to him when he was a boy.
And interestingly, it's another one of these overlaps that we have with Lord Summerisle from The Wicker Man, of course, which we spoke about. Again, you get these characters who are almost pretending a kind of metaphysics, or who regard the metaphysics that they proclaim as a path to very material ends. Very material and very hewn ends.
Yeah. All the window dressing, and actually they are, if you pardon an expression, vulgar materialists.
They're vulgar materialists and also conservatives, right? That's the other thing. Yeah, they market themselves as being revolutionaries when in fact they are the ultimate conservatives. It's another overlap we have is with the Joker from the Nolan films, of course.
Yes.
Who we've spoken about before, the ultimate reactionary, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this is why this film does make me think of Nietzsche. I mean, it does kind of portray Christianity as the slave morality, as Nietzsche diagnoses it as sort of a moral system devised by the herd, by the slaves, by the weak, to comfort themselves and to also take a kind of revenge upon the values of the lord class, the warrior type of human. Nietzsche wouldn't talk about class, of course, but it does something. It does something that's actually, I mean, I think there are some insights there in Nietzsche, but I don't find it at all a particularly, useful or valuable way of looking at it. This film adapts that. I mean, as I've said, I don't think there's any sort of insight that Nietzsche has that isn't almost immediately transcended when you introduce the idea of class struggle, which this film does. Of course, this film does that.
Quite explicitly. Right?
But it shows, Prospero is almost kind of like Nietzsche, because Nietzsche thought of himself as this great revolutionary figure. He thought of himself as the Antichrist, in the sense that he was going to overthrow Christian morality, and that he would be remembered as the personification of this new morality, which, when you boil it down, it's not really much more sophisticated than just social Darwinism, or what turned into Randian objectivism, to be honest. But of course, he didn't realize
narcissism, in other words, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he thought of himself as this great revolutionary figure, the Antichrist, who would institute this new type of morality that was all based upon, the morality of the Superman and so on. And the fact about Nietzsche's philosophy is that it's just basically reactionary stuff that preserves the status quo.
Still sounds very Prussian, doesn't it?
I mean, it is proto-fascist. I mean, people try to defend Nietzsche from that, but it's true. It is proto-fascist.
It is proto-fascist, yeah.
And that's Prospero as well. Prospero thinks of himself as this great sort of progressive, shocking nihilist who has all the, he's kind of like the ultimate bro first-year philosophy student, who's going to, I don't even believe in God, actually, and it's like, yeah, okay, so what? And
yeah,
it's sterile. It doesn't actually overthrow anything or shock anybody.
Nihilism being
it doesn't.
bomb,
And also,
nihilism as a bomb.
And everything he proclaims operates within purview of traditional ideology anyway. It's the language of Christianity.
Yes, it is just Christianity, just upside down, which is why he's a symbol of the upside down cross is invoked. As people always point out, when Satanism is depicted on screen with the cross inverted, people will point out that's not a Satanist symbol, that's a Christian symbol, because you have Saint whoever it was who was crucified upside down. Yeah, true, but in this film that's actually really apt, because all they're doing is being Christian, but with it upended. That's literally all they're doing.
Yeah. That's exactly it. It's the most bizarre thing, right? Trying to pretend that you're being sort of metaphysically and politically revolutionary, when in fact you are reinforcing prescription and nothing more.
This is why I said earlier, the mid-20th century approach to that, particularly, in something like American evangelicalism or something, it's like, well, actually, you can just use all the trappings.
Right.
You don't have to look as though or attempt to break away from it. You can do exactly that, but you can keep all the trappings. You can just warp the teachings. You could just say it's kind of about something else, or basically not even do that. You sort of say nothing. You just leave it void, and then it's just sort of scrambling for anyone who actually knows. It's like, it's your classic, well, here's the form, you don't need the content. You don't actually need any detail, because you actually go searching for some detail, you might find the Christ that's talked about, for example, in Pender's Fen.
Exactly right, which is,
and then your brain's going to be like turned to mush, trying
utilizing
to
the form and ignoring the content. I mean, that is absolutely a reactionary,
and in fact, it reminded me
fascist technique, isn't it?
Yeah, and it reminded me tremendously of I always forget the name of this American evangelical pastor, televangelist guy. Well, anyway, I remember we were saying about, obviously, because this is the Red Death, this is the story of the plagues, and talking about the COVID era, and I can remember specifically him being on something like Fox News or something, which is obviously the home it would be for him, and saying, going through these ludicrous narratives about, the standard kind of Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell thing about why we were having COVID,
conspiracy theories, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. But he then has this moment where he really starts to talk about the hardships that are going to be faced by his flock, And he said, "I'm very." And you get this wonderfonderful moment of like, oh, he's almost coming across like a human being. So he's saying,
almost getting there,
I'm
but not
terribly
quite,
worried
right?
about my flock because they're going to face hard. I mean, some of them are very senior, they're very old, everything. And then he turns to the camera and points his finger down the barrel of the lens. But I'm going to tell them now, don't you stop tithing. Just because you think,
Of
just because
course.
you can't work, don't you stop tithing. Your
Don't you
tithing is the
dare.
most, and he's like vicious with it. It's like, wow. I mean,
It's
there it
crazy.
is, laid bare.
Well, let's not forget.
I still want
not
my feudal rights. You know.
Yeah.
historically not that long ago, you'd have been like murdered for not giving your tithes to the church. So it hasn't changed that much, has it? Really,
I mean,
historically
it's just the
speaking.
most extraordinary moment. I mean, it's. I bet it's on YouTube somewhere.
Oh wow, yeah.
You know.
I mean, that is the most amazing thing, isn't it? That you can have someone who proclaims to be Christian,
Yeah. I mean, at least we
who's
had a
obsessed
furlough
with
system.
money.
I don't know whether the states even had any kind of furlough system, being that it's the. I don't
Oh.
know. But obviously we
No,
have
they
here.
didn't.
But people would have been like getting no income, and there he is banging on to them about you've got to keep tithing or else it's damnation for you.
The one thing that Christ is unambiguous about in every interpretation of the Bible, every text that exists, his hatred of material and money. The only thing that's consistent from gospel to gospel,
Yeah.
from version to version to version of the Bible, the one thing, and it's the one thing they've all turned on. It's the one thing. It's like, oh no, we ignore that.
But it's
that
fantastic. I mean, it is something to behold. I mean that almost objectively. Actually, it is something to. It's one of those things that I often wanted to actually see which writers or which actually cover the history of the American evangelical movement in the mid to late 20th century and into the 21st century, because the approach to sort of warping the teachings or obfuscating them or whatever, it's got to be a fascinating journey, because you've got to effectively change the whole code of what it's about in plain
and you've also
sight.
got to market the language in such a way. You've got to sort of like you've got to obfuscate so much. Because the language, even the very plain stuff, it is an instruction. Give away all your worldly goods. It is an instruction. It is unambiguous.
Yeah.
But somehow you've got to muddle that. You've got to muddy that. Oh well, he doesn't.
It's done in a soft
mean...
sense, even here, even with your Church of England and so on, which is basically a Middle England club for in many respects.
Well,
you've got to do that softly here, but it's so fascinatingly extreme when looking at American evangelicalism. So
very much so. Prosperity gospels. It absolutely is a contradiction in terms, as it should be in Christianity.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating. And so it just in those terms of seeing a character like Prospero,
right?
At least trying to break with the language,
he will, he manifests it in so many ways, because he will say things like "do as thou wilt," but only under my instruction, because if you stray, I'm going to actually murder you.
Yeah
He's as rigid and authoritarian as any pastor or inquisitor or whoever.
And of course you watch it. I watched it. My God, it's like, I wonder how many of these like single color rooms are at Mar-a-Lago,
Oh, yeah.
That'd be too interesting for Mar-a-Lago.
It would be too
absolutely.
I'm
far too
endowing.
Well, there is. I mean, I will give Prospero this. There's ideology here. There's poetry here, isn't there? At least there is not at Mar-a-Lago at all.
No, exactly. I mean, God.
As I say, I think this comes through in Price's wonderful performance, and also in the way Jane Asher interacts with Price in her role as well. There is a good man in there somewhere. He's, Prospero is 99% a twisted evil shit. Don't get me wrong, but there are the sort of broken, crumbling fragments of a good man still in there, rattling around somewhere, and every now and again you can see it.
it just
every now and
comes out,
again,
doesn't it?
In a
Yeah,
strange
and
way,
just
the death
emerges.
cuts the
the
narrative
sadness
short.
in his eyes, or something that he'll do, and
Yeah.
particularly as I say, the way Jane Asher looks at him sometimes,
Yeah. In a sense, the
it gives
Red
it a
Death
lovely texture.
invades and curtails what should be the narrative.
Mhm.
It just comes in and ruptures it.
Yeah.
Because if this film had a fourth reel, it would have been a redemption story. But the Red Death comes and goes, no.
No, we're not having that.
Yeah,
right? We're not having that.
I don't know. I don't actually think Prospero's capable of redemption. I think like the bits are there, but they're not sufficiently close together that
This is
anybody
why
could
I
actually
think
join them
No,
up.
Red
You
Death
know?
comes in, because it's like,
Yeah,
that's not gonna
exactly.
work. So I'm basically coming in and putting
Yeah.
a full stop on this here
Sadly,
and now.
I mean, no one else in the narrative is sufficiently sophisticated to bring them out, because Francesca, unfortunately, isn't. She is
I mean,
not
she's so young.
sophisticated.
I mean,
Right,
she
right.
has-
she's had this very, the existence she has. I mean, she's not been educated. She's incredibly young, and she's taking an ideology at face value herself, because that's what she's been brought up in. So there's no nuance to it, and that's why she ends up bereft.
Well, and also
She has
it's
a great
why,
line at one point, doesn't she, where Prospero confronts her with some sort of hypocrisy about the history of Christianity. I think he mentions the Crusades or the Inquisition or something, and she says to him, "I have no learning, I can't answer."
Yes.
But she knows he's wrong, or at least that the point he's making with truth is a bad point. But she doesn't have the education to answer.
No.
I love stuff like that. Something like that happens in American History X, which is a film that I have lots of trouble with. There's lots of things about it that I don't like, but one thing I really do like about American History X is the character of the sister of Edward Norton's character, because she argues with, as he's descending into neo-Nazism, she argues with him in several scenes through the film. But she argues with him really badly, and it's a really good reflection of something that I think is true for millions of people, which is that the film could have been better if it had remembered this about its audience. Millions of people, they know that this stuff is wrong, but they can't put it into words why. They can't argue with it because they don't have the facts and they don't have the arguments with which to counter it. So fascists keep on winning the debates, despite the fact that they are clearly wrong, and the people that they're arguing with know that they're wrong, but people don't have the mental equipment to fight back. And that's kind of the position that Francesca's in this film.
That's exactly it. That is exactly it. And it's kind of why Prospero takes her in many respects, isn't it? I mean, he knows that there's no way she's going to be able to stand up to him, ideologically speaking.
And I think subconsciously he's kind of hoping that she will.
Yes.
I think that's the way I read it anyway.
Yeah.
It's odd, isn't it? It's really strange. It's almost like he sees. Yeah, it's almost like he misinterprets his own curiosity in her. He sees it. He superficially he sees it as a game. He's going to corrupt her or enlighten her in his own language. But there's something else going on there. There's a different dynamic. Because she almost does change him in many respects, not profoundly, but she brings out a certain, like you said, Jack, a certain kindness, a softness in him.
Yeah, it's like he wants to be a better person, but he can't convince himself to do it. But she gives him a reason to kind of be a bit softer.
Yeah, it's very strange,
and he talks to her, doesn't he? He talks to her in a way that he doesn't talk to anybody else. He never has discussions with Alfredo or Juliana. No. He debates Francesca. He explains to her. He listens to her when she talks.
He betrays himself to her. He's actually kind of honest with her. When he says to her that, the world is full of famine and pestilence and war and death. This is not the world of that's overseen by a benevolent God. It's such a confession. I doubt he has ever said that to anyone. I doubt he's ever used that language to anyone else.
This is a picture of somebody who desperately wants to be understood and desperately wants to be validated, but could never admit that they needed anybody else's good opinion, but nevertheless does need it. And at the same time kind of knows that they're wrong about everything and wants the other person to put them right. It's very... this is in the script, but it's also in Price's performance. It's very complex.
It is.
You know,
He's a phenomenally complex character, Prospero.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's nuance. You can't watch this film on a sort of surface level, listen to it while you're doing something else and get these nuances. You need to sit down and watch the performance as well as listen to it. Because it comes out in the framing, it comes out in the tiny little interactions between him and the other characters. It's Juliana a couple of times. Like, he doesn't ever have a profound philosophical conversation with her because he has kind of dismissed her. She's not interesting to him anymore. But there is a conversation.
She's just obedient, isn't she?
She's just obedient, so she's not interesting, right?
Yeah, there's no traction there. There's no grit in the machine. There's
no will.
There's
no volition.
Yeah, she just loves him, I suppose, except that there's no content to it. It's pure ambition. It's pure
right. And it's also, as he says, as he accuses her of, he says, there is key interaction between them when she comes to him and says, "I'm ready for the most dread rites. I'm ready for the last ritual." And he says to her, "Oh, the pragmatism of women." So basically, what he's accusing her of there is that she is doing it because she's trying to secure her position, her station. Of again, her very material station. Right, because she's threatened by Francesca, right? But ironically, he's confessing himself. He's actually again, it's another example of projection. That's exactly what he's doing.
His contempt all the way through the film for people who do as he says, his contempt for people who agree with him, his contempt for people who, to all apparent outward appearances, share his values and share his worldview. Every single one of those people, he hates them.
Hates them. And you see it all the way through, don't you? That scene where he's saying to them, "Oh, you sound like a braying jackass, be one."
Yeah, I love that.
I love it. Price is loving it. But the contempt, it is a total expression of dominance and total.
What's really interesting as well is in the direction of those scenes, because there's several of them, and because the actors are so uniform in this, I can only think that it came from Corman, which is don't react with confusion or resistance or offense. Just do it.
Let's do
not
it.
One of them, there's not so much as a flicker across. In fact, they welcome it. When he asks someone to debase themselves in some way, be a worm, they just smile and do it. And it's a very interesting directorial decision because, the expectation is you will see them look shamefaced or affronted. Not at all. No. And of course, that feeds into the very diagnosis that you've just made about Prospero, which is they're all too willing. And therefore, he despises them. If there was a flicker of, at least he could revel a little bit in their embarrassment because he knows that there is the grit of resistance in there. But there never is. He says to someone, "Be this," and they're like, "Yeah, great, okay,
sure."
He even kind of likes Gino and Francesca's father, doesn't he? He goes out of his way repeatedly to not kill them. He lets Gino go. He keeps on going to see them and interacting with them. He likes that fight back. He likes the fact that they're human, that they have spirit still, that they're not just these obedient sycophants, that they're not like him.
Yeah.
This is
there's so much going on there.
Yeah, and it's mirrored in the relationship between Francesca and Juliana as well. There's the lovely scene after Juliana is I can't quite place it. It's not. I don't think it's after the sacrifice dream where she becomes like the female sacrificial victim of every exploitative religious hierarchy throughout the entire history of the planet. It's not. It's a bit earlier than that, but there's something. She burns herself. She brands herself.
Yeah, it's after the
branding. Yeah, and she goes to see Francesca. And it becomes clear as the scene goes on that she's there because it turns out to be a trap, but it's not Juliana's trap. Juliana was actually trying to let Francesca and Gino go. She really was.
Sincere. Yeah, she was sincere.
And part of that, of course, is that she wants Francesca out of the way because Francesca is taking Prospero's attention. But there's also, after the initial scene where she's very hostile to Francesca, in that second scene, Juliana is actually quite friendly. She's quite.
There's a kind of like sisterly quality going on there.
Yeah, she's realised that Francesca isn't she doesn't want to be there. She doesn't want Juliana's place.
No,
And Francesca is kind to Juliana, and Juliana does respond to it in a way. She's too far gone to really respond properly, but there's a lovely energy between the two actresses in that scene as well.
Yeah, there really
there's
is
so much detail in this, and grit and marbling and texture, and it's
more more so than you would expect from a film of its positioning and of its station. So much more. I mean, have you guys read like some of the reviews from the time of its release?
I haven't. No.
Well,
they are so
sneery,
They are so snifty. They're so grudging.
Firstly, because
they can't entirely like condemn it because it is clearly a brilliant production.
It's clearly brilliant,
level, right, on a purely technical level. But there's this snifty kind of like, well, it is very low rent, don't you know? It's very pulpy, but for that kind of film, it's actually rather good. That quality, and also total, and I mean almost complete misunderstanding of what the film is trying to do, of its subtleties, of its nuances. They do market Prospero as being a libertine and as being a pure Satanist, which he is neither.
They completely miscarried. But I found one review which in some ways was even more frustrating because this critic actually started to notice there's complexity here, and of course being a critic of a certain stripe went, it's inconsistent, characterization,
I love that one,
the plotting like, no, you were so close, and you've just
close, but you couldn't allow yourself to do it, could you?
Yeah, well, because don't forget, we're all Clockwork Oranges, aren't we? We're all Clockwork Knights. We just do things in a completely simplistic, cause and effect. It's like, for heaven's sake, you were almost there, and you've just, but you knew that the critic had to dismiss the film because it's a Roger Corman film made 3 reels. With a minimal, he had to dismiss. So he just went, "Oh yes," and if you think this is operating on any kind of deeper level, well, I'm here to tell you it's all terribly inconsistent and all the characters are contradictory. It's like, no,
no. I love that one. I love that one. The film is coming from a studio or a style or a genre or a director that I a priori.
Yes, a priori. That was the word I was trying. That was the phrase I was trying to come back.
Therefore, all its ambivalences and ambiguities and complexities, all the things about it that make it interesting, that make it a gnarly, work of art, they're inconsistencies,
right?
And incoherences.
Yes, they're mistakes.
They're mistakes. Yeah,
it has to be. They have to be mistakes. They cannot be examples of artistry or ambition or anything like that.
Yeah,
dearie me.
We alluded to this.
Where would critics be without that flex?
I know,
right?
But we alluded to this in the WhatsApp chat we had. Really, what is, apart from a color palette and it not being a Swedish director, what really is the difference between this and The Seventh Seal?
Right.
The difference is that this is better.
But this is better, right? This is better. Comes up all the time. I mean, this dynamic still exists. It's still out there.
That's it.
It's still out there.
Signifiers, and also it's responding to, confidence is conferred on people.
Right.
And confidence was conferred. No, I'm not saying Ingmar Bergman was any sort of slouch or hack. Ingmar Bergman did some great films, but once the confidence is conferred, and confidence was not conferred on Roger Corman in the same way because he didn't come from that route, and he was assigned to a studio and he worked in certain budgets. But this film
New Money Darling.
This film isn't a million miles from The Seventh Seal in terms of its anxieties and the things it's pursuing. One does it in a more material based one, but it's doing it in a more metaphysical one. But I'm sorry, I think if anyone without having those biases watches these two films together and concludes that one is like just dreck and the other one is high art, I'm sorry, you're wrong.
I'm sorry. I have, I do not. I mean, not to get on my high horse or anything, but as a writer, I don't make that distinction between the pulp and the high. It just doesn't exist.
Well, it's also very boring. It's very
boring. It's very boring. It's very synthetic. It's very inconsistent. I remember
it's historically illiterate, apart from anything else. When I started my degree in English literature, one of the first texts we were given to study was Henry Fielding's Tom Jones.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that you have to understand about Tom Jones, if you're going to understand what the book is and what it means, is the reception that it had at the time. And the reception that it had at the time was this outrageous, filthy, disgusting, evil,
right,
totally unrespectable piece of trash, worthless, corrupt. Samuel Johnson called it every name under the sun. This is a major work of the Western literary canon. At the time, it was considered porn.
Yeah.
So if you're making those sorts of distinctions now, if you're doing that, if you are just reflexively discounting stuff because it's genre or because it's whatever, you're not just a Philistine. You know nothing about the history of criticism.
Yes.
You are absolutely right. I mean, I remember when I first started getting stuff published, when Strange Playgrounds came out, there was a great. And don't get me wrong, it was a really nice review. It was very kind. It really did a lot for my self-esteem. But it described the book as literary horror. And I was like, what does that mean? I had never come across the term before. I was just, what does that mean? And it's this term that's cropped up over the last decade or so, which distinguishes certain kind of horror from the pulp. It was like a way of saying that awful term, and I fucking hate this, by the way, elevated horror.
Mm-hmm.
Fuck off. My immediate response is, fuck off. I'm not even going to engage. It is nonsense. It is an absolutely inconsistent nonsense term. And it only exists as a form of snobbery. It's a form of insulation for critics and certain kinds of academics to insulate themselves from criticism. That's all it is. It's annoying.
Look, we're 150 years out from the death of Charles Dickens, whatever it is, I don't know. In 150 years, 200 years, Stephen King is going to be occupying a cultural niche in Western culture, similar to the cultural niche currently occupied by Charles Dickens. Now you can like that or you can not like that, but that is what's going to happen.
That is the truth, right? That is the truth. Yes.
I mean, whatever the flack that King's work has taken, not only the sheer amount he's pushed out, but his name is so synonymous with a whole corner of novel writing. Yeah, he's guaranteed a certain immortality.
He has changed what literature is.
And yes, that's the other thing. Yes, regardless about
whether you like it or not,
the level of criticism. Yeah, he changed the course of the river in terms of how popular horror fiction was written and how therefore a lot of popular films in the genre turn out.
Absolutely.
And he is the Charles Dickens, the Alexandre Dumas of our time. He just is.
Totally.
Yeah. You can like that or you can not like that. That's fine either way.
Yeah.
But it's true.
It is the truth.
Yeah,
it is the truth.
Just
millions, well, or at least hundreds of thousands of words that man has just churned out. It's incredible. I'm just even looking at it on that level.
It's that desire to, and it's something that's gotten actually worse with the advent of the internet. I would say, certainly with internet criticism, that desire to categorize everything. To put everything into very clean slots.
You can criticize King and Dickens in one respect almost on the same level, which is in most of their novels go off the boil about 2/3 in. And then they sort of, there's this point where you're like,
not untrue.
It's
not untrue.
Where the hell are we going? There's this very impactful beginning, and then it's like it fizzles out, and it just takes that next sort of catalyst to make. But there's always these. It feels like an acre in a even King novels I like, and even in Dickens novels I like. We go, okay, we're marking time a bit now.
Yeah, it's true. It's absolutely true. Take me up, Judy. Sorry.
Dick-
Sorry, I can't.
Dickens was writing to shift units. You know,
Yeah.
Dickens published his own magazines. You know, it's-
Mr. Paid by the word at one point in
Yeah.
his career, and very clearly so.
I mean, admittedly, I think it's quite amusing because obviously Poe and Poe's position, not only as the inspiration for this film, of course, but he being associated with us now as the writer of sensationalist magazine literature,
Right.
and as a critic, the absolute scathing reviews he would make of literary. I mean, he was terrible about oh gosh, who was such a famous prose writer? The name has now escaped me. Oh crumbs. No, it's one of his
I
contemporaries.
know he famously wrote the
Torin. Said he wasn't. Longfellow.
Longfellow. Yeah, I thought that was probably who you meant.
Longfellow. Yeah. And said, it was just his privilege and and his connections and maybe one or two good lines.
Oh, probably righter than he was wrong. I think probably. And famously, also the How to Write a Blackwoods article essay that he wrote.
Yes.
Despite being very influenced by things that he read in Blackwood's articles.
Right.
Yeah.
He's a very interesting figure in and of himself because, of course, we had a whole portrayal of him which really very firmly embedded itself in people's understanding of Poe, which was probably made up by Griswold, the Reverend Griswold, who did his
the hatchet job.
The hatchet job, and of course a lot of that is still kind of that's all true, isn't it? It's lingered, but still a very.
There's also, of course, the
character.
Yeah, there's the peculiar circumstances of his death and the fact that he was almost certainly an alcoholic. But yeah, I mean, a hell of a lot of stuff people still believe about Edgar Allan Poe is just complete nonsense.
Nonsense. Yeah, it's myth making.
Yeah.
But Poe's a good show, actually, because his work it kind of occupied a similar position when it was published. It was considered to be popular.
Yeah.
It was mainstream and it was Gothic, and Gothicism at the time was low literature. It was low literature, don't you know? Whereas now,
he actually
obviously,
he defends Berenice, I think, to an editor who's sort of queasy about it by saying, "Look, you have to grab the reader by the throat and shake them. We're trying to sell magazines here. For fuck's sake, come on!"
Yeah. Right.
And actually, those parameters, those boundaries, I think in his case really are part of the reason that I've reread Poe over the years. It's I've got a finite space here, and I'm going for intensity 11 immediately. Yeah. And it's great. I literally, when we were doing this, thought, well, I'm going to read a couple of the prose pieces, read some of the poetry, and I found, and I just thought, this is so perfect because it sort of ties in what I was saying earlier, sort of the anecdotal thing about my dad recording Pit and the Pendulum that time. But when I was about 9 or 10, there was one Christmas where I think one of the supermarkets, like Asda or something, was basically very cheaply putting together sort of complete works of certain things, and for something like Christmas when I was 10, I was given the sort of complete Edgar Allan Poe. It's very cheap. I was given a complete Oscar Wilde, and I was given a complete Henry James, and also the Leon Garfield Shakespeare stories.
Oh, I had that. Yeah.
So this was sort of my sort of very literary Christmas one year, and it was great because I dug out this book and I said I'm actually going to read that Masque of the Red Death and Ligeia and this, that, and the other from that edition, and it's still there. And it's still got
That's superb.
This belongs to me, age 10, and there it is.
Wow.
And I've been going back to those every few years all my life because they are wonderfully intense and. But the great thing about them is they're not just wonderfully intense, shocking horror stories. They are very melancholy.
Yeah,
they do carry a real sadness to them.
There is something underneath, isn't there? There is this quality to Poe's stories, and it's not something that's necessarily overt. It's in between the lines. It's a feeling that radiates off the page of desolation and despair.
Abjection.
It's a thanatic quality. It's a total thanatism, which I love. It's sumptuous. It's absolutely beautiful.
And I think the great appeal may be the direct contrast between that, what you've just said, which is absolutely exactly true, and the joy in language that is packed into every sentence.
And in fact, it's very interesting that I got Poe and Wilde for the same Christmas, because something such as, for example, Dorian Gray. I mean, it's just luscious to read. The very words, the very
similar.
It's almost too much. I mean, it's. I mean, I love Dorian Gray. I've reread Dorian Gray every couple of years again all my life, and there are points in Dorian Gray where you have to put it down and just get a breather, because it's so rich and varied, and it's so savouring.
There's a sumptuousness to it, isn't there? There's an
and of course that
overindulgence
fits with
almost.
the content. I mean, that fits with what the story is about. So again, it's the form reflecting the content. But you actually have to sort of. And I mean, the thing with Poe, of course, is because the stories are tight, they're taut, they're short. But there are times you feel, right, hang on, just take 30 seconds.
Just a minute, just a minute. I need to pause in this repast. It's too rich, isn't it? It's too rich. That's the nature of Gothicism, insofar as I'm concerned, in literature. That's part and parcel.
Or overwhelming.
Certainly
that late Gothic. That very, fantasiacal, capital R romantic Gothic that Poe is the absolute pinnacle of. It's lush and decadent and
it's a chocolate dessert.
Semi-rotten but it's on the turn as well. It's on the turn. The cream is.
It teaches you to
there's
like
a tang to the cream because it's
teaches
starting
you
to
to
go off.
That's the interesting thing. It teaches you, like, you might like this, and you shouldn't, but there you are.
It's interesting how, obviously, on home territory, it's very much canonized. Certainly things like The Raven and The Telltale Heart, they're read by every American schoolchild.
Well, they're myths now, aren't they? They're myths.
But here,
everyone
I
knows
think
those stories.
in this country, there's still a certain known but not known about Poe, in a sense.
People know of him. They certainly know The Raven. They probably know the Masque of the Red Death. They know the broad outline.
The image of the Pit and the Pendulum, certainly. But it's quite a gap between here and his home turf, I think. And
probably so.
You could imagine maybe one or two of the poems being taught to maybe year 7s or year 8s as a sort of way to poetry. But it's not going to go beyond that.
Yeah, I mean, almost everyone in the country, certainly of our age, knows The Raven because of the Simpsons adaptation, obviously.
Oh, yes, of course.
Read by James Earl Jones.
Yeah.
Which is actually very good. I've got to say, it's a beautiful reading that he gives.
Well, it is James.
It is James Earl Jones,
Poe has something that every writer who wants to become incredibly famous needs, which is that he is very easy to parody. This is something that all the writers that have become deeply ingrained in sort of the cultural consciousness, they all have that. They all have that there's something about their work that can very easily be picked up and parodied. And of course, the Raven possibly most of all, because it is such triumph of meter and scansion that it invites parody in the same way that the lyrics of Gilbert and Sullivan and A Visit from St. Nicholas, the poem The Night Before Christmas, because of just their rhythmic perfection.
But what I love about The Raven is that it is meticulous and it is beautifully worked out, but it is also, and I know this firsthand because obviously, as we were saying earlier, but when this was all introduced to me, it's the kind of poetry that a child understands as poetry, because there is a lot of end line rhymes and internal rhymes, and there is a particular meter to it, and therefore it feels almost like incantation.
Yes, like magic.
And therefore like magic, and that really has so much of appeal to a child, finding this stuff,
yeah,
as it did with me,
It's the music of it, isn't it? That's
Yeah.
what appeals initially. It's the music, and it is
And you
sublime.
want to say it aloud. You want,
Yeah,
It
and it sort of
demands
sets
to
you
be
up.
performed. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes.
It-
Yeah. Yeah.
It demands that you perform it, and it teaches you how to speak it. As it's that kind of meter.
Yeah.
It tells you how to speak it rhymthmically.
Yes. Yes.
It's I mean, this is something that Poe did very consciously and very deliberately in his works on aesthetics, in his works on composition. He wrote about this. He said,
Yes, he has
poetry
essays.
should be, absolutely, poetry should be pleasing. It should have that wholeness and fullness, and I can't remember exactly what he says, but yeah.
But it's very
He
interesting.
was a great proponent of the idea that poetry should, it should feel nice going down.
Yeah.
It shouldn't be
It's
work.
true, because I mean, also, I mean, I always say one of my favorite poems operates in the same way in terms of richness of language and very, very interesting meter, and the fact that as you say, it's nice going down, and that's Tolkien's Errantry, which is the most extraordinary poem. There was a merry passenger, a messenger, a mariner, who built a gilded gondola to wander in, and had in her a load of yellow oranges in porridge for his provender, and it goes on. It's just gorgeous to just recite, just off the top of your head. It's absolutely wonderful. There's a lovely line about web, a spider, but it's not Shelob, but it is a spider of filaments, airy thin, to snare her in. And wonderful, but it's got that similar thing to Poe. But one of the earlier in the week, sort of in preparation for this, I was listening to Philip Glass's Fall of the House of Usher opera, and it occurred to me, I thought, interesting that Glass should be fascinated by Poe, because it's not the only project that Glass. And I managed to find an interview with it, with Glass, which I thought, well, that sort of makes a peculiar kind of sense with it. This composer, very driven to minimalism, sculpted sound, that's his MO, and saying, as someone who works in that vein, I am therefore, as a consumer of art, very driven by people who are baroque or romantic or densely layered or vivid, because that's not what I do. And he said, and therefore the idea of working with Poe's material as opera, knowing that my tradition is to sculpt back, chip down, bring to essential form. He said it's the most exciting. I think he thinks it's the most satisfying opera he's done, even though it's not as well known as Akhenaten, say, or Einstein on the Beach. It's his personal favorite.
Oh wow!
Yeah, because
Poe does
it's
have
like,
this
I have to
ability,
work with Poe,
Yeah. He has this. I don't know it. I would be really interested to hear that, actually. But Poe does have this ability to inspire fascination in certain people, even negative fascination, like the people that hate him. Like, I mean, Griswold is an example.
Yeah.
You don't go to those extremes to try to blacken somebody's reputation after they're dead. Exactly. Yeah. But no, I mean, people have become. I mean, famously, Charles Baudelaire was a great admirer of Poe, almost obsessed with him. But
Lovecraft.
Lovecraft, yeah. I mean,
Lovecraft regarded him as like the forefather or something.
I mean, Baudelaire was almost as a problem for Poe as Griswold, except that he exaggerated his life in ways through adoration and love of his work. And yet, for a European audience, for a European literary audience, you say Charles Baudelaire, and then Charles Baudelaire. You say Poe, and like
there is a
back again, and yet Baudelaire was so wrapped up in Poe.
There is a British photographer, I believe he died a few years back, but he was reasonably famous, called Simon Marston, I believe.
Right.
And he used to do. He was utterly obsessed with Poe, and he used to try and invest his photographs, his photographic work, with that quality we were talking about earlier. That subtext of death being beautiful, of morbidity, and the macabre being attractive and wonderful. And if you read Poe while looking, like with one of his photographs in the area, you can feel it. You can feel it actually in the photographs. It's really strange, really beautiful.
Interesting.
Oh, well, actually, there's a very good documentary which he presents, which is where he talks about this. I will link you to it at some point, called The
Yeah, I'd
Twilight
like to see
Hour.
that.
Yeah, that'd be
The Twilight Hour. It's quite
Mind you,
good.
you're saying
It's
about
quite good.
photography. I think that one of the other joys of this movie is you can basically pause any moment.
Yeah, and it's a
And you've got
painting.
you've got a painting.
It's a painting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Every frame is painterly, and it's so. I mean, that's the other thing, right? The technicalities of this damn film
On
is
a technical
massive.
level.
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
geez.
Positioning of people as well. I mean,
Right.
positioning of people is really interesting in this movie. You know, things like having the Red Death sat against the gnarled tree,
Yeah.
and there's people behind him, and he talks to people who are actually further into the picture. The mise en scène is really interesting. It's not
And
just
I love
people
how-
talking parallel to one another.
Right.
I love how people don't question him either. People,
Yes.
the
Right.
old woman at the start,
No,
and then the
it's
child at the end,
acceptance. Yeah.
and Gino in the middle. They
Yeah.
just accept this
Accept him.
figure,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and it's like, I don't know. The film doesn't quite do this, but the feel I get is that they're not quite seeing what we're seeing.
Mhm.
They're processing the image. They're interpreting it in some way. I think somebody talks about him as a holy man. Told me. I think
they
it's
refer
Gino.
to him as the holy man on the hill. They refer to him as.
So they kind of, they look at him or it or whatever, and they kind of process the image as a friar or something, But
Yes.
they're
Yes.
not. Yeah, it's really interesting. He's obviously not quite seen head on, or just when you're with him, you just accept the reality of him.
He is just there.
Yes.
He is just there.
He's elemental, right? Like the deaths are. He's part of the world.
And
That's the other thing, right? These things are part of reality.
Yes, and this has just occurred to me, but it's the common people who see him, isn't it? And then the only sort of rich person who ever sees him apparently is Prospero, because he's walking around inside the castle during the Masque, and the other revelers are completely oblivious, unlike in the story where the appearance of the and if you read the story closely, it's not even clear that the figure is supposed to be in red.
Right.
The story says that he's dressed in the habiliments of the grave or something like that, and that he's wearing a mask that looks like it's
too real.
a dead face.
That's right. And it's too real. It's upsetting to the
but it's got.
That's the point.
I think the idea is that he's come as a victim of the Red Death, so the face is splattered with the blood that seeps out of the pores or something like that. I don't think in the story he's actually supposed to be wearing red. I think what the story is implying is that he's wearing a shroud or something like that. But in the story, the revelers, but the other revelers see him. The revelers are horrified by the there's a thing in the story about, like, even the most jaded person, they will have a line, beyond which they're shocked or disgusted, and the revelers are disgusted when they see this figure who's come basically as a plague victim. But in the film,
joke.
in the film they do, because it frightens them. That's why they think it's unacceptable. It's because they're afraid. In the film they don't see him. It's only Prospero who sees him. So that's an interesting.
Prospero misidentifies him. So
yes, Prospero misidentifies him, but he does see him walking through the Masque. And up till then, the only people who've seen him have been common people. Yeah, and that's a really interesting inflection, isn't it?
That is fascinating.
Is it because he's with Francesca? Is it because he's changed? Is it that old thing where there's a strange way in which the position of the king is sort of closer to the position of the peasant than the intermediate layers, which of course is the basis for the thing on a chessboard where the pawn makes it all the way across, it becomes a king. This is an idea that goes right the way back to the ancient Indo-European peoples, is where that comes from. That the king kind of has, and again, this echoes with the idea that Prospero, completely unaware, because he thinks he's the Lord and he thinks he's all powerful and he thinks he has this transgressive ideology, but actually he's a slave as well. He adheres to a slave morality as well. So he can see this figure that is this figure of essentially, history erupting from below.
Yeah,
it's so It's so fertile.
The chess image works very well, actually. For
it does thematically. It feeds
the
into
kicking
the
off
notion
the pawns and then the picking off of the noble pieces and so on. Yeah,
it feeds into the themes of the original short story as well, which is it doesn't matter what your station is. You know, death is going to find you. Your fate will find you eventually. It doesn't matter. All the trappings of mortality will be gone.
Yeah. And of course, Poe was writing that in a world that was racked with deadly communicable diseases. This was this was a pre-penicillin world. This was a world, not the bubonic plague so much anymore, but still yellow fever and cholera and
hereditary
typhus
syphilis,
and
obviously
tuberculosis and syphilis. Yeah, absolutely. And of course, I don't know when this was written. I don't know if Virginia had died by now, but he lost so many.
Well, his mother had died of tuberculosis.
His mother, yeah, exactly.
I mean,
and then his stepmother as well. Then
yes, of course. And there was because it was his stepmother who. Oh, there was the teacher, wasn't there? The teacher as well who had encouraged him to write. A woman teacher, who
women kept on dying.
Yeah,
around him.
And this was a big thing because there was a sort of sense that she became kind of a mother figure, but he might have had even something like a teenage crush on her. So he had these three women in his life who were all pivotal. One who'd encouraged him, one who had taken him in because she had been adopted herself. I mean, despite his relationship with the father, that seems to be a purely driven thing on her behalf. It was like I was adopted. I want to give this, and obviously his mother. Of course, was very famous in her day, wasn't she? She was
yes.
Opera.
She occupied, such a strange social position to come from as well. Because in those days, you could be a famous and admired and feted actor or actress, but simultaneously to be an actor was, it was not respectable. It was a bit like it was a little bit like being a gladiator in ancient Rome. You could be famous and admired and your name scratched on the wall and stuff like that, but you were still a slave.
Yeah.
And of course, people, everywhere Poe goes, it must have felt like people he loves die of sicknesses. How do you feel if that happens to you? You feel like a plague carrier, don't you? You feel like you
become such a staple of so many of his pieces.
You feel like you walk through the world, and as you pass, people drop dead.
People drop dead. Yeah. You feel accursed, right? Which was certainly part of his psychology. He's very clearly a very depressive guy,
Yeah.
And of course, it manifests itself in such extraordinary ways. I mean, of course, there's the, certainly from it should be, but particularly from our vantage point, the marriage is like, astonishing with this child, basically. Then he lives with her mother, and then, but there's almost a sense to it that, that it might have been a non-sexual thing as well, that he was just trying to build a family.
I think
who knows?
Certainly was. Yeah, there was also. I'm not making excuses for it, but there was also.
I was treading carefully as well. But at the same time, there does seem to be this view that's like, nothing was ever consummated. This was a man who was determined to build families because he always kept being without them.
Without them. Yeah.
And contemporary accounts talk about him treating her like Dresden China. And there's also
his education on her and so on and so forth, wasn't it? He didn't have much money, and he still invested a lot of money in making her accomplished piano player and musician and all these various things. Extraordinary.
And I believe
after the mother even after she died, didn't she? He
absolutely
looked after the mother for
and he was incredibly demanding and controlling with all that care. I mean the marriage to Virginia is partly to do with he's kind of desperate to get hold of her because there's talk about her marrying other people while he's away. There's an incident where he gets wind of this and he writes and he says, "Wait." I mean, it's a different world, and it's not
completely.
And that leads me to something in the film that is going to be uncomfortable for
I think
modern
I know
audiences. Which is the fact that the little person character Esmeralda is not played by a little person; she's played by a child.
No, and in fact, it took Vicky to point out because obviously I was having some sort of blind moment because obviously I knew it was a child, and I knew. I said, and I just kept going. There's something singularly I can't work it out. This is something, and Vicky said they've given her breasts. That's it.
Yeah.
And
Yes.
I wasn't consciously, I couldn't identify it. But it's when something's out of joint.
Yeah.
When you're like, there's something. All the information I'm getting here, there's something not right. And so I'm saying to Vicky, so what is it I'm picking up on that said that that's making this particularly uncanny or uncomfortable? And Vicky, it's because they've given her sort of like false breasts. I went, oh gosh, yes, because it is a child, but playing a grown-up woman, and everything that comes with that. So it is uncomfortable. It's a very strange image.
Yeah. There's also the fact that her voice is dubbed by by clearly an adult woman actress.
Yeah.
Which is also uncanny and strange.
It is weird.
Very odd.
I don't know. I don't have that much of a problem with it because just the innocence of the whole thing just seems so completely apparent to me. There's no sexualizing of that character.
No, it was more the strangeness. They talk about her being information. I think.
Yeah. They talk about her being beautiful, and then you get this sort of skeevy remark from Alfredo. But then Alfredo is a character we're obviously meant to despise.
Yeah, exactly. He is skeevy, and he gets his comeuppance, right? He absolutely gets his comeuppance for that.
Yeah. But the scenes between her and Skip Martin's Hop Toad, they are so. I mean, it's his performance is incredible. Yeah, because he somehow manages to put across the idea that he's in love with this character who's supposed to be an adult woman. He's the same age as him, but at the same time, there's nothing uncomfortable to me anyway about the way he interacts with the child on screen.
No, I think they're quite careful about that. Actually, like they're being quite careful about that,
and the complete innocence of the intent, I think. Makes it kind of work, even though it is sort of inherently a jarring thing to watch.
It's a strange image, definitely in 2025 in particular. It's just a strange image, but it's not totally uncomfortable.
No. It is as I said, it was just the imagery where just having this moment of watching someone going, I can't quite put this. I'm getting lots of different bits of information. I can't quite put them together. Yeah. But thankfully, I was watching with someone else who was able to go, I know exactly what you mean, and this is the thing that you're struggling to.
Yeah.
But this leads me to something else, which is I kind of want to mention about the Corman Poe adaptations as a whole, which is that they are remarkably free of misogyny. For films of their type,
films
and
of this era, right?
Yeah.
Considering particularly Pit and the Pendulum is almost built around punishment of a woman,
right?
And yet it still manages to eschew the obvious pitfalls of that.
Are not intended, presumably.
Yeah, sorry, no, it was unintended. Yeah. But no, you're absolutely right, and interesting as well because that the particular name of the actress in that escapes me at the moment, but she had done a work in Pitt.
Barbara Steele,
and she had done a lot of work with Mario Bava, of course.
Yeah,
and
Black Sunday.
Corman, which is a fantastic movie, and there's a great deal about just purely the aesthetics and cinematography of this, which is reminiscent of Bava as well. Not just Bergman, but Bava. That's a great film, Black Sunday.
That's an amazing film.
Yeah, Black Sunday's awesome.
That's again a great moment from childhood where my parents were, I think, out, and they put me in charge of my grandmother. But my grandmother was already quite an elderly lady by that point, and she fell asleep. And the television was on, and Black Sunday, under its title The Masque of Satan, because it had another title, came on the television, and I must have been about 11, and I was like, right, that's me then. And of course, it's got such a visceral opening scene with the mask being fixed to her face, Barbara Steele's face.
It's hideous. It's really violent,
But
I was disappointed when you said that she'd gone to sleep. I was thinking it's going to be a story about little Elliot going, "Come on, Granny, let's watch the Masque together."
Someday,
I let Grandma sleep because I wanted to watch it.
I love the way they don't even just place the mask on. They hammer it.
Well, it's great valet, isn't it? Oh, but that's a cracking film.
I just like Mario Bava's filmmaking. I'll be honest. I was asked to write an article for an insert book for Planet of the Vampires, a
I love Planet
Blu-ray release of Planet of the Vampires, and that was great.
Or shall we just call it Proto-Alien? I mean,
actually, we could call it Proto-Prometheus, because I did not realize until rewatching it this time just how much Prometheus nixed from it.
Yeah.
Ribs from it shamelessly, completely. Planet of the Vampires is a better film.
That's a great film. Planet of the Vampires.
Much better film.
I said, but the Barbara Steele connection, But also they're lovely.
I think
because
the casting is a lot of why it works. I think Barbara Steele's so fucking awesome, and
again,
she's
another
invests that character with so much,
passionate kind of.
The eyes, the freaking eyes, it's terrifying.
But she makes that. She makes that villainous character in Pit and the Pendulum. It's just because that person is that way. It's not. It's not anything to do with the fact that she's a woman.
No.
And
no.
I think it's remarkable if you look across. Even Ligeia, which is probably the weakest of the films. I think. I don't know. I don't think it's a misogynistic film. I don't think it's a sexist film.
I think the nice thing about particularly that core of. Actually, I know. Yeah, I see what you mean by.
House of Usher is kind of angry about the way women are treated.
About the way women are treated. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it inverts the story. It inverts the story.
Yeah,
this film. The film's kind of angry about the treatment of women as well. The way Juliana is thrown away by Prospero. And even it gives Francesca she's one of the few survivors of this entire thing. So anyone who mistreats women in this film gets got.
And they get got.
Look at what happens to Alfredo.
Yeah, and they're just a great little set of movies that almost like in their own pocket universe. So even though this is the best one, there is something really lovely about doing the set. Even Premature Burial, which is not Price, it still feels very much part of this, I say, this little pocket universe. I only think that's a shame that Price wasn't available to do that one, because I would have loved him to have got the set,
Yeah, absolutely. The completist in you. And the Haunted Palace is even. I quite like the Haunted Palace. I think that's a fairly good adaptation of Charles Dexter Ward. It's about as good as anybody could have done at the time.
At the time, let's be honest. Yeah,
it's great stuff in it.
What period is Murders at the Rue Morgue? The adaptation. What era are we talking then? Is that 1970s?
Which one, sorry, George?
The film Murders at the Rue Morgue.
Is that you mean the one with George C. Scott?
Yeah. Is that later on?
I think that's an 80s TV movie.
Is it 80s? Is it really? Oh my goodness! Wow.
And I don't think that's not Corman, is it? I don't think.
No.
No.
No. It's just a Poe. It's just a Poe adaptation. It's just a Poe adaptation.
It's kind of fun in its own right. That I don't
remember much. I only ever saw it as a kid, so my memory is very fuzzy.
Yeah, it takes all sorts of liberties. It makes Dupin into a policeman, and all sorts of stuff like that, and it gives him like a daughter with a love interest and so on and so forth.
So it's not great, not amazing, right?
Scott's great. Scott's great, of course.
Always value added.
But
of course, Dupin. Mentioning Dupin there. Right. That's another great contribution from Poe. It's not only the Gothic literature; it's the fact that he basically creates Sherlock Holmes before Sherlock
basically has his own Sherlock.
So much so that in A Study in Scarlet, Watson even compares him. They even lampshade it. Conan Doyle lampshade.
Yeah.
It's like
Yeah, Poe kind of creates Sherlock Holmes in the same way that Lord Byron kind of created Dracula. It's at a couple of removes. Yeah.
And of course, Byron's a great shout, of course, because Poe was obsessed with Byron as a child.
Absolutely
Yes.
obsessed.
I mean, to the extent of, affecting that whole romantic poet, persona,
My
extraordinary
favourite.
teenager, I think, by the sounds of him, because he was sort of simultaneously, a goth, basically. He was he was a boy goth, but also,
clearly,
yeah, indeed, but also a bit of a jock as well, like a really
Oh,
odd
very much
combination,
so,
because
yeah.
like he did that straight, he'd take those dares, wouldn't he, like swim for miles in fresh water and go run marathons and things. He was in a peculiar combination.
He was very odd accounts of him, like swimming in snow melt rivers and like that, just nonsense like that.
Yeah,
He was
but
a
at the
tough
same-
bastard.
Yeah.
And he was very popular as well. It's just, again, despite the image that we have of this kind of this guy who's sort of a perpetual angry outcast who's and there's a lot of truth in it, because he did spend an awful lot of his adult life sabotaging himself and creating drama and stuff like that. But the young Poe at Military Academy, one of my favorites. He was popular, and one of my favorite stories about Poe is that one of the reasons he was popular with the fellow cadets was that he was constantly writing and reciting, kind of on the spot, humorous poetry and quips and skits and squibs and things like that, and they were all satirical and scatological, and his fellow cadets loved them. And Poe, with this absolute wonderful asshole ruthlessness, he gets his mates at the military academy to chip in and fund the publication of his first book of poetry. And his first book of poetry is his serious poems. So all these guys who think they're his friends, who've chipped in so that they can get a book full of these funny, rude, satirical poems, they get whatever it's called, Tamerlane, and they're all outraged. They've all been burned, and Poe's like, I don't give a fuck. I got my book published.
Yeah, I got my poetry now, didn't I? So you do what you can, don't you? Now.
It's a pity he wasn't at West Point, because I could have put him in my short story at Christmas.
Put him in the Sober Man, yeah.
Yes.
I was
Little
thrilled when I was
Poe.
reading about that when I was doing the research into the actual historical story, that it was true. Jefferson Davis was there at the time, and Jefferson Davis was very nearly run out of West Point and everything, because he was involved in this rum smuggling. But it was the fact that they looked upon him very favorably. And of course, the rest is history. But he was basically protected, despite the fact that some cadets were basically court-martialed, because it was like, he's kind of special. He might amount to something, But
as it always
Well, he should have paid more attention. Maybe then he wouldn't have employed Braxton Bragg and listened so much to Robert E. Lee and paid more attention to Joe Johnston. Well, but then I'm glad he didn't. So
basically,
right.
Ceded several states from the from the Union, But no,
brilliant.
It's that's
well, guys. I mean,
yes.
that's
Amazing movie.
Final
Amazing
thoughts,
movie. Masterpiece.
Oh
Yeah,
love it.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
mean, just the joy of coming back to something that I thought I already liked and finding it's even better than I remember.
like it even more. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this time round, just the depth and the intelligence, the ambiguities baked into this film.
Probably
It's
as well,
absolutely-
because I know where we're ending up. I know that we're going to get together and do these, and therefore you do. Well, maybe because I'm sometimes a bit of a lazy viewer, you do watch the slightly different eye, and it's like anything. And this time it really was a case of, there's much more to this.
Yeah. I mean, what I have an inkling to do actually is get on to my pal Jonathan, who works at Arrow Films, and see if there's anything coming up that they're doing which we could do an extra for or something. A chat like this.
Wow.
I think that would be fantastic if they could maybe gather us together somewhere and we could have a chat about whatever. I think that would be wonderful. I think that would work very well.
I would learn that.
I'll have a chat and see what they're doing, see what the plans are. I mean, I've got one coming up for In the Mouth of Madness. I don't know when that is, but there's an essay that I've written going in the insert book, and there's also going to be a chat just like the one we did with Hellraiser.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll see what's coming up in the
Excellent.
pipeline, and see if I can sort of nudge. We could, we
Arrow
could do
is such a
something.
great
Give
company.
them the
I have-
breakdown of our Clash
Yes,
of the
they are.
Titans podcast, because that's the one with all the viewing figures or
Well,
listening
that's
figures.
insane. I don't know what
That's our viewing
happened
trial.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That one, it clearly the algorithm caught that one for some
Yeah.
reason.
Because I wondered how, because obviously you guys are in the know more, but
Hmm.
I wondered how Wicker Man did, because obviously
Wicker Man
that's a
did very well.
famous
Very
film.
It did very well. A lot of people watched that one.
Yeah, that's
It's into the
interesting.
thousands now. It's
Oh,
into
wow.
the thousands on
Gosh.
that one.
This is so mind-boggling,
Oh,
because
that
I
was-
always assumed we were just listened to by about 3
Yeah.
people.
Well, it vacillates massively depending on the subject. If
Yeah, of course, I
the
can
subject
imagine,
is the more popular the subject, the more views it gets.
I mean,
Basically,
even among my friends and so on, when they say, "Oh, if you've got a film recommend," and if I've ever recommended something like, for example, Barbarian Sound Studio, they look at me as if I'm like, "What's that?"
Yeah.
So, oh, yeah, that one might have gone under your radar.
Definitely.
But
Which is why I push. I really
still
pushing the
worthwhile doing
Sven one, because I think it's
the
easily
Penn
the
Sven's
most
got
obscure.
a real cult, and it's just about reaching the cult. It's about them
Yeah.
finding it.
That's it.
Because there's definitely a cult of people, a little bit older than me and Jack, who fall squarely into being huge Penn Sven fans. They're sort of more in their early 50s, because I've seen them like talking on things like, well, when Twitter was a thing, and but even Blue Sky, and it's like, oh, I'll try and nudge it in their direction. There's a couple of people I know, and I said, oh, I've got there's this podcast, it's just about it catching fire. Because if it catch fire with that group, they'll really.
They'll really
one of those
go
things.
for it,
They've got Penn Sven's got a really hardcore. I've noticed a hardcore cult.
Yeah.
But they seem to be peeps, sort of, I say, a little bit older than me and Jack.
So it's just getting it in front of the right eyes, right, and then it will catch fire.
Presumably, because they were the right age in 1990 for the repeat. That's the only thing I can think about. Whereas Jack and I were a little bit young, and you might have been in your high chair, George.
I was very young in 1990.
Luckily, I had that slightly older friend who had the VHS recording of that showing. So yeah,
so you seem to benefit that, and I always benefited from the fact, as I've said before, my cousin, who's 10 years my senior, was always lending me things or letting me watch stuff and everything. So that, but although I didn't see Penn Sven, but that came along much later. But
quite frankly, I'm shocked we didn't have it on video somewhere. I'm surprised my mum didn't have it in her vast collection.
I actually can't remember what because I must have got Penn Sven about 10 years ago, and I can only assume that I must have read something about it in something like Sight and Sound or in some kind of blog, because I can't remember what the catalyst was for me getting it.
I recall
I must have just read something about it.
I've heard it mentioned a lot, like in folk horror circles and whatnot, but I'd never seen it up until quite relatively recently. Mind you, that's true of a lot of this stuff. It's like the Stone Tape. I'd heard it mentioned and referenced so much by so many creators that I like and
I remember
respect.
getting the Stone Tape out of the library. Because I just saw the name Nigel Neal, and by that point, I'd had a copy of Quatermass and the Pit when it was released on VHS as a sort of compilation, and it was literally a family member bought it for me because they knew I liked classic Doctor Who, and they went, "Oh, this is kind of inspired a lot of Doctor Who."
Yeah,
and I loved it. And so I saw Nigel Neal on Jane Asher, so there you go, another link, and went, "Oh, I'll have a look at that because it's Nigel Neal, and I rather liked the Quatermass and the Pit." When I was given that in the 90s.
I remember when I first encountered it. It was actually in a magazine, and I believe it was a film magazine of some description. But it was it was a Halloween special. It was a Halloween special. They did like a top, like a top 10 most horrific moments or something, and the Stone Tape was one of them. The conclusion of the Stone Tape was one of them. And
I
absolutely stand by.
I think I first heard about it from Doctor Who fandom, because of course Doctor Who fandom would talk about other things, Nigel Neal and classic telly at cross fertilizers, and by that point I I was already a fan of the Hammer movie adaptation of Quatermass and the Pit. I still think that's a great movie.
Yeah.
And then I remember the BFI DVD release, and this would have been 25 years ago now, but it was advertised in things like, Empire magazine,
Yeah,
cinema
SFX,
magazine,
that kind of thing.
Yeah. And I remember seeing it and thinking, I must buy that next time I'm in HMV, which used to be a shop, children.
Yes.
Yeah. Long time ago now.
Yeah.
Long time ago.
Oh, I've got to thank you for a shout out actually recently, Jack. I think you retweeted something about the Omega Factor, and I thought, my God, I've not seen that in about 20 years. And I was just getting to a point where I was like, well, I need something for a certain day, and Vicky had never seen it, so we did the first episode the other morning, and it's great. But I hadn't thought about it for years. About 20 years since I last saw that.
It's a great series. Variable as these things always are, but there's one episode that I remember is particularly good. It's about a group of students who start playing around with a Ouija board. That's actually genuinely kind of scary.
Yeah,
and there's another one
enough, which is good actually, because 20 years is a bit of a time. But it was like, well, I've forgotten enough of this. But it's such a great opening as well. I mean, you're right in, and it's so strange.
Yeah, it's great.
And I love
it's the Omega Factor, yeah.
Yeah, I love that actor who it's not Cyril Luckham who's obviously playing Greatorex. It's the actor. We know him as Ruben from Horror Fang Rock, Jack. I forget the name of the actor, but I was quite amused because he was in a scene with the young lead, and I thought, Colin Baker's turned into you. That is basically who Colin Baker is now. It's like it was extraordinary. It was really great. And it was like, and I remembered this sequence with all the street lamps turning out. I went, that's very effective.
Great.
That's very effective.
Great.
It's very in that kind of like the Stone Tape, George. It's in that 1970s videotaped television, but it's got a bit of like Casting the Runes in it. It's got all these influences, and
absolutely sold. It's
great fun.
Alley.
Yeah.
Right up my alley, that does.
I enjoyed the first episode.
Every now and again, it is proper unnerving. Like there are several episodes I remember with moments and images that are. There's one where they're in a haunted house and they're doing the full sort of monitoring rooms with meters and stuff like that, and that's a good episode. There's one where there's the one in Scotland. There's several episodes where there are moments and images and things like that which are genuinely sort of that's a bit scary. That's actually a bit scary.
I like that. I really do.
But it's also that thing of watching shows like this, and there's a period in it. I mean, this is 1979, so I'm still a bit of a figment, but right up to things like things that were showing in the early 90s and I said it to Vicky as we were watching the Omega Factor. I said it's that somewhat mind scrambling thing, just watching people in their just at railway stations or in cars. I said, there's this moment that's been crystallized that we lived through, which is now looking incredibly distant.
Just gone.
But it also was a reminder. There was a scene of the lead at a railway station, and the old Intercity 125's behind him in his clothes. And I said, the frustrating thing about this is that this is what when modern films and modern television do, for example, the 70s gets so wrong. It was the point that slightly frustrated me when I was watching High Rise, is that the era becomes costume, because because I was saying to Vicky, I said, look, the guy doesn't have a big thick moustache, he doesn't have a big wide collar, he's actually wearing a composite of what is things from the 70s, but also the drag factor. He's wearing a couple of things that are actually from the late 60s, because they've probably been in his wardrobe for years, the characters. I mean, and it's little things like that. It's the drag factor that period pieces never quite get right, that not everything is in 79 is 79 and then a kind of stylized 79. It's all made up of bits and pieces of but watching this first episode, it's like, yes, that's it, because it's authentic, but at the same time, wonderfully mind scrambling, because it's like, that's kind of how I remembered the world as a child. And it's like, if it wasn't for this just bit of tape that's got it on it, how would I have known that was what it was like? And it's the same when you get to like the early 90s and things like the House of Cards, for example, and you're like, the way the cars are, the very rectangular cars,
the computer monitors,
the computer monitors.
Oh my god!
And it's just like, this is how I remember the world. It's
that perpetual brownness of the 80s.
Yeah.
Glass
And that's a big drag
etc.
factor as well. Like, that's a drag factor from the 70s, the late 70s.
Of course.
Because, of course, when anyone does the 80s, they do it in neon blue
and
white and everything. It's like, no, it wasn't. It was still,
it was
the
very
70s
brown.
was just
it was
saturated
very brown, the 80s.
through the 80s. Yeah. Absolutely.
What I meant to ask, guys, I know this was ostensibly going to be the kind of like the concluding episode of this series, but what would you like to do next?
Well, presumably we have to rejoin Hannibal.
Yeah, that'll crop up again, definitely.
There is that. There are some more titles that we did mention as possibilities.
A couple of others, didn't we? Yes.
Robin Redbreast.
I
believe we talked about doing the Dead of Night series and Robin Redbreast
that's wicked.
in kind of one go, which I think that'd be cool.
That'd be a great idea. I'd love to do that.
We did also mention a couple of other things in the sort of folk horror series. I believe we talked about Night of the Demon and A Field in England. Those are still on the table.
Great.
Yeah, I don't know. It depends what people want to do. I'm pretty easy. I like the idea of doing those TV ones.
Happy to keep going, and it suits me. Our fortnightly meetings are just fun. So I don't mind what the grist for the mill is. It's that's fine.
I'm very open to any any potential there.
If we go with that as a suggestion, Dead of Night and Robin Redbreast,
I'm up for that.
I'm up for that, definitely.
That'd be a nice,
cool.
a bit different too. A little bit different. I like that idea. Yeah,
bit back to that Stone Tape Ghost Watch kind of strand.
Yeah, and of course, I do want to talk at you guys about video games at some point. So
it's got to be interesting. He's got two complete.
Yes, I will.
He'll be speaking like in runes to me.
I will endeavour to break it down.
my new podcast. I don't speak video games.
I have to call it that. Yes.
Sometimes it's quite interesting as well, because it's partly. I remember there was video games around when I was a kid, and there was video games up because we had like home computer at one point and so on.
Yeah.
But I think the main reason it didn't catch on for me is I don't have much sight in my right eye, so my depth perception's really bad, and therefore when I used to play them with friends, I was really bad at them. I might have been bad at them anyway, but there was always this thing of like, I can't quite see what's going on at times, because the background would shift at a different rate to the sprites in the foreground, so it never really sort of caught on.
Called parallax scrolling, Elliot. It's called parallax scrolling.
Oh, right. Okay, thank you for that. But again,
it's the illusion of depth.
I wonder if it's to do with the fact that I've got so reduced vision in my right eye. It's just a theory.
Could be.
But now I'm like,
I should play video games because I'm good at giving the illusion of depth.
But then I thought, more recently, I just thought maybe it's a good thing, because I've got such an obsessive personality that I didn't need another thing in my life that would eat up hours, At
the moment, there is such, in horror video games, there is such good work being done. They're not just good horror video games, they're good text. They're just absolutely wonderful texts.
Between films and television and listening to music and reading books, I was like, where would I find the time? But if I had video games as well, I would literally not leave the house, which also sounds kind of nice, but but sometimes I've got to leave the house.
I know the feeling. There's a couple I definitely want to do. There's a series called Amnesia that I desperately want to talk to you guys about. I think you would very much appreciate those.
And every friend I ever had who was into gaming, they used to put me on edge, because they would certainly by the time guys I went to drama school with and everything, they would go on like 3-4 o'clock in the morning because they couldn't get off a game. And I'd be like, and I used to be so slightly on edge. It's like, oh my God, no, that's no good for me, because I do have that obsessive thing.
Yeah,
and I would bear right the way with them, and it's got to be no good for my health.
you can loot some of these games, honestly, particularly now. You know, now they're becoming so vast and so immersive. You can lose hours very easily. Very
scary.
It's terrifying. Yeah, it is absolutely terrifying. But they are. I mean, some of them are so stunning.
Yeah,
they are absolutely stunning. I mean, the one, again, the other one I have to talk to you about is Silent Hill 2, specifically the remake that came out recently. It's amazing.
Oh, wicked!
It's amazing. It's one of the best horror experiences I've ever had.
There you go. There's high praise.
It was formative, absolutely formative. In bits by the end of it, absolutely in bits. I did a let's play of it on my channel, and you can hear me in the last chapters just going.
Oh, fantastic.
But yeah, we'll sort that out. So, because I'm going to actually need to make notes for those.
Yeah, of course.
I have to prepare for those. Especially if we do build up to the big one, which is Pathologic.
Right.
That's the one we initially discussed.
Is that its title, or just how you feel?
Oh, well, it's a combination of both. You know, a little column A, a little of column B. But that's kind of what started the discussion. You know, that one, that is something very special, but very difficult to talk about. Very hard to discuss because of it's just the way it is, just its nature. It is the anti-video game. So bizarre. Yeah, we'll get there, because that one is art. That is something very special. Pathologic. Okay, guys. Well, here we go. Once as per anything to pimp out.
No.
Oh, people know where to find me. At Times Carcass, Patreon, $1 a month, everything in advance.
Links below.
Eruditorium Press. I don't speak German.
All links below, guys. Same here. Strange Playgrounds, published fiction, Amazon. Type in George Daniel Lee. Horror films, Hellraiser, Blu-ray set. Ins and Nuts of Horror, My Life in Horror. Loads of those coming out.
Send me money. I'll just. That's fine.
Yeah. that yeah. I suppose I should set up a Patreon.
You could just send me money. It's fine.
Yeah.
I like how we've gone really monosyllabic. You know, me write, you read, podcast. Listen.
What is that?
Patreon money.
Yeah, all of our links are below, and I'll put descriptions of what they are. Okay. So there you are. Yeah.
You give, me take.
Keep it easy, I say.
Oh my God, we're regressing here. I don't know what's going on. But thanks, guys. Until next time.
All the best.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.